Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host. The Yao being a revolution, and Trump is compromised. And the American empire is finished. But before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, revolution is a way of life, and revolution is for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I got some revolutionary breakfast for y'all. Let's get into the content.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Joining us today is the excellent Syed Mohammed Marandi to give us some of the insights on the growing tensions between the United States and Iran. We see now that the U.S.
Iran refused to submit. Iran will not yield to Trump. Trump will get no wins. He's losing against China. He's going to lose against Iran. He's losing in the tariff war, which means our pockets is going to hurt. He's been compromised. He's been compromised. They tried to assassinate him a few times. They're waving the Epstein files around. We're going to look into the lady who the main woman who sued Prince Andrew and the Epstein people. She got to a car wreck. I think she got a couple of days to live. We're going to look into that too. But Trump is compromised. And the small hats want to tank America. They already said America like a great big calf they want to carve up. Well, they're going to absolutely do that. And Trump is definitely helping them.
And Israel has posed Iran with an ultimatum, that is, make a deal or they will attack.
Yeah, Virginia.
What do you make of these threats, and how do you think Iran's going to respond to this?
It's going to be very difficult for the United States to attack Iran because although it has bases across the region, I think they're already under a lot of pressure by regimes and
all of the Arab kingdoms. They just came out yesterday. I'm gonna have to find their video, and all of them they was on stage together saying their bases will not be used against Iran because Iran done called out Turkey, so they know Iran not gonna play with them. Iran already said if they gonna go, everybody going down. If they gonna be under attack, everybody gonna be under attack. You see. So that little strategy of the U.S. thinking they just gonna hide out in Saudi Arabia and attack. No. Saudi Arabia, the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, gonna get wiped off the planet. Playing right now with Iran.
In the Persian Gulf, not to use their bases, even though that won't help them because U.S. bases are already being used to gain intelligence. They've been used against Iran when Iran struck back at the Israeli regime. Those bases have many purposes, and the Americans use them in many different ways. It's not just about airplanes taking off of runways. But still, the Americans would probably use Diego Garcia, which is very far away. And the B-2s and B-52s would have to fly all the way to Isfahan. And I guess that's something like 5,000 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, Iranian air defenses are very capable, and these planes, they'll have difficulty having escorts. I would assume they'd have to bring a couple of aircraft carriers into the Indian Ocean.
Benjamin Netanyahu around here bragging about he controlled Trump. I ain't seen Trump come out and say nothing about that. The man bragging that he controlled that man.
And also Iranian anti-ship systems are, I know that the Iranians can sink an aircraft carrier and other ships at 2,200 kilometers. I don't know if they have further range than that right now, but it would be very difficult for the Americans to carry out any strike on Iran. That's the point.
And get away with it.
And they would be very vulnerable. The Israelis, if they were to attack the Iranians, we've already seen that happen before. Their capabilities are limited. They can say that they destroyed Iranian air defenses, but that's obviously nonsense. If they had, they wouldn't wait to strike Iran again. They would be doing it day in, every day, like they're doing in Syria. In fact, Syria is a very good example. Syria's air defenses were always weak, but the Israeli regime is still bombing them, as we saw literally hours ago. So if the Israeli regime were to strike Iran, Iran would hit back very hard. Iran already plans to hit the Israelis. That is on the table. It's something that will happen ultimately. Whether the Israeli regime strikes or not it's still going to happen. And so for the Americans so the Israelis have that problem. The Americans have their own problems. A war with Iran is simply not possible, Glenn. No matter how I look at it, the Americans, if they want to really fight Iran, they have to bring in a million and a half soldiers.
They don't,
which would take many months, and still the Iranians would destroy.
America don't have 1.5 million soldiers want to die for Israel. That's a lie. That's not true. They don't have it. They don't have it. And once they see the death that's going to come with this, they definitely not going to want to go fight Iran. What are you talking about? They don't want to go fight the Houthi rebels. They're going to die over there. No. Big mistake. But Trump, in over his head, what he going to do? Netanyahu got him by the balls. He got to play tough. It's all bad. There's no easy way out of this. He done talked too tough. And Iran,
still they can't protect
Yemen
their assets in the Persian Gulf. It's just not doable with all those underground drone and missile bases. I'm not saying that the Americans won't do it or that the Israelis won't do it, but I think that those who are sane in Washington, they would definitely be opposed. And ultimately, if it happens, the damage that they would be doing to themselves is greater than the damage that they can do to Iran. A few planes cannot hurt Iran significantly.
Well, you say that even though it might not be rational and they can't win this, that they...
And then Iran said, if you attack us a week or two later, we definitely going to produce a nuclear weapon. That don't even make sense. You're not going to be able to stop them from getting that. So they're saying, if you attack us, we definitely going to get nukes. What the hell? And they're going to destroy Israel. Unless this is the plan of the white supremacists the whole time. I don't know. This seems like some psychotic shit. This is way, there's some deep shit going on here because it's all bad. So why would they want this? See, lunatics is running the world. Crazy people. And also, remember, I told you this, they already say it's too many people on this planet. Never forget, they say they need about 500 million people. That's it. What? They want billions of people dead. Well, how do you get to that?
Might do it nonetheless. And one can put many a lot of problems forward here. That is that if the US it walked away from the previous deal, so I very much would agree that Iran doesn't really have that much reason to trust the US. It would possibly also walk away from a future deal in the future. Also, indeed, for Iran to accept this, it could set a very dangerous precedent by allowing itself to be bullied. On the other hand, though, if you think that they might attack nonetheless, even if they won't be able to win, such a war would be nonetheless quite devastating. Is there any desire or preparedness, you think, within the Iranian government to try to speak to the Americans to find some acceptable middle ground, or is this how do you view this?
I don't think that the Iranians have offered anything new. They've rejected direct talks, and I think that was an important step. We also saw Dr. Larijani, the senior advisor to the leader, come on television and say that if the United States strikes our peaceful nuclear program, that Iran will develop a nuclear weapon, or it will develop nuclear weapons.
Now, he came out and said that yesterday. The spokesman for the Supreme Leader is the one who did the fatwa, who said no, they wasn't going to make any nuclear weapons. But they just come out yesterday and said, if you do what you're saying you're about to do, then we're going to be a nuclear power, and then you're going to have to deal with nuclear weapons. They need to think about what they're doing. They really need to think about what they're doing. Them people not bluffing. It's not a bluff.
And he said that we've taken the precautions already. Even if they strike, they will not be able to set back our program. Meaning that Iran will, whether they strike.
Don't forget, submarines changed the whole trajectory of playing with Iran. That's why North Korea got America in check, because they let them know we got submarines. We'll come. Not only do they got the missiles that can come over here from North Korea, they got the missile technology to reach us, but the submarines mean they can sneak up on your ass and nuke you. That's why they need to stop playing with Iran, because Iran could put some nuclear weapons on their missiles and put them in them submarines and come over here and pay us a goddamn visit. That's dangerous to be playing these games.
Strike or not, Iran will be able to develop a nuclear weapon or do nuclear weapons very swiftly. So these two messages have already been sent to us, to the United States and to the West in general. And I think that makes it all the more difficult for the United States. What did he exactly mean by the fact that they cannot set back our nuclear program in the context of a nuclear weapon? I can guess what that means, but I can't. I don't want to say it because I don't know, and I don't want to say something that I'm not sure about. But I think we have to take it at face value, and that means that if the United States strikes, Iran will very swiftly have nuclear weapons, and they will have the ability to fire them. So that is what Iran has done. Iran is also, although I should point out, has also stated once again that it will continue with indirect negotiations. In other words, it's not going to discontinue anything. It's going to be business as usual, because we've had indirect negotiations for all these 40 some years. It's been on some instances where we've had direct negotiations, such as over the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. But negotiations have never been completely cut off. So I don't think that the Iranians have taken any steps that would make the Americans happy. I think it's the reverse, the opposite. However, Trump, when he said that, some of his statements seem to indicate that he is, when he said, when we heard from the Americans that they're considering Iran's offer for indirect negotiations, I think that is perhaps a sign that he's looking for an off-ramp, because Iran hasn't offered anything new. It's always been there. Nothing new has been offered by the Iranians. So that could be interpreted as a shift in U.S. policy, but a shift in U.S. policy under Trump really doesn't mean anything, because late at night, he may suddenly decide to upload something on the internet.
They go into war because Iran that became too strong of a military power. Israel won't allow that, and Benjamin Netanyahu say he controlled Trump. That's just a fact. They can't allow that, so they're going to smash the U.S. military into 1,000 pieces fighting Iran. They don't give a damn about how many soldiers get killed, brain dead, come back home, commit suicide. They don't give a fuck how many homes get broken up. They don't care our economy going to crash. They don't care that y'all won't be able to drive y'all vehicles. Gas going to cost way too much. They could care less. They want Iran destroyed. That's it. That's the last piece over there. Then they feel like they'll be the strongest power over there. They deal with Turkey, but they want Iran destroyed. But they don't understand Iran is saying that if we go, everybody go, especially Israel. And they're not going to negotiate their missile technology. That's non-negotiable. That's how they're going to be able to defend themselves. They're not negotiating that. Well, that's what Israel and Trump want. I done heard them say this on TV several times. And Iran's missile tech, that ain't none of your fucking business. I thought you were talking about nuclear weapons. No, they talking about all weapons.
Internet, or say something to reporters on Air Force One, or early in the morning, breakfast may not have made him too happy, and he could say something then. So a shift in U.S. policy is not really something that we can count on, and that is one reason why it is not really possible to give Trump anything, give him any concessions, because Trump is not a person who you can trust. The United States cannot be trusted, but Trump in particular, he is someone who will, he just look at the tariffs and what has been going on with Canada, and how every day things are changing. Every day the policy on tariffs until Liberation Day, we've seen so many changes, and the United States is just not reliable for the Iranians. So I think the priority right now for Iran is to be strong. My understanding is that they are preparing themselves for the worst. And I think that people in the Persian Gulf countries like the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, if they don't have to be there, I would leave.
Yeah, because they're going to.
But, well, you've been an advisor for Iran's nuclear negotiation team. How would you define Iran's, I guess, nuclear posture? Is it correct to define it as a nuclear threshold state, meaning that it has the, I guess, the scientific, technical and material capabilities to develop a nuclear weapon? But
see, when I seen Iran call Turkey out, I knew they wasn't playing. They let Turkey know, because this is about leadership in the Islamic world too. They watched Turkey help the U.S. destroy Iraq and kill Gaddafi. I mean, kill Saddam. They watched Turkey help NATO bomb Libya and kill Gaddafi, and that bastard bragged about it in Turkey. So Iran just letting them know, if you think that we're going to be fighting the U.S. and its minions, and you're going to sit here and really help them and then try to take the leadership in the Arab world, you crazy. Because when we bring Saudi Arabia down, your ass going to get wiped out too. And without a nuclear bomb, Turkey can't defeat the Iranians neither.
Crossing that line would be easy, but it has decided not to cross the line. And, well, is this the correct, I guess, definition of where Iran is? And would there be other scenarios, or do you think Iran, as you said before, it would develop a nuclear weapon if it was attacked in, again, what Trump threatens? Or would the mere amount of threats, credible threats, be enough possibly to convince the Iran's government that it has to have a deterrent? I know you're not in charge of deciding policy, but how are you reading the, I guess, your impression from the Iranian government?
Yes, there's no doubt that Iran is a threshold state. I would consider Iran to be.
We just got to prepare as a people to rise out the ashes. That's what don't try to patch the ship up. Fuck all that. Because this is what Trump want to do. We just got to be ready to rise out the ashes, a new nation, and continue building like we've been doing for tens of thousands of years. But the American empire is finished. It's done. These people are psychotic. They want to follow the Zionists. So be it, bro. So be it. We just got to be ready for the aftermath.
One of the top 10 most advanced countries in nuclear energy, more advanced than North Korea. Probably the only countries more advanced than Iran would be the United States, Russia, China, India, perhaps, Japan, maybe Brazil. That's about it. I think probably maybe France. But I think outside of these countries, Iran is by now the most advanced country. And it can swiftly develop nuclear weapons, and it has the ability to fire those nuclear weapons. And now with the advancement of technology and the way in which computers function nowadays and artificial intelligence, you don't need to blow up a bomb or do a test to make sure that it's workable. Everything can be done through simulation. So I have no doubt that the Iranians have that capability. They've had that capability for quite a while. I think the difference between now and, let's say, 10 years ago is that now they're probably capable of doing it very swiftly. Maybe 10 years ago it would have taken, I don't know, a few months or something like that. Or a few, but that capability exists. Does Iran want a nuclear weapon? I don't think so. I don't think Iran ever wanted a nuclear weapon. I don't think before 2003 Iran was seeking nuclear weapons. And I don't think Iran today, as we speak, is seeking nuclear weapons. The Iranians believe that nuclear weapons are trouble, because once you have them, then everyone else wants them. It's not just an issue of the Israeli regime or the United States. it's a problem where you could have tiny.
That's not true, because North Korea got them, and everybody didn't want them. See, that's what they done put in the Iranians' mind to say, if you get them this Saudi, no, because they're gonna want Saudi Arabia to have. They want the Middle East. They want all of those Muslim. They want all them people to blow each other up. They want India and Pakistan to destroy one another. North Korea just protected themselves when George Bush was talking shit. No, Japan didn't get nuked. South Korea didn't get nuked. So that's a lie that is just repeating. That's what they tell the African nation. Oh, you can't have one because then everybody gonna want one. You didn't say that about Britain and France. Why do they have them? The fuck they need with nuclear weapons?
Tiny countries seeking them in future for their own security. And many of these countries are not very stable. None of the oil and gas-rich countries in the Persian Gulf are stable. They're all family dictatorships. None of the Arab countries in the region are stable. Turkey, nowadays, we see the problems inside Turkey. It's not, then we have Central Asia. So nuclear weapons is not something that the Iranians believe are...
It's untrue. See, he's saying that from a Persian, Iranian point of view. It's untrue that the the Gulf dictatorships are unstable. No, they are stable. The only problem is Israel. That's the only problem. If Israel wasn't the people in the streets already do everything that the king and shit say. They don't. No. They do exactly what the kings and the leaders say in those countries. The only problem that the people have is Israel treating the Palestinians like crap. That's what makes the Middle East unstable. Without that, people would be okay. That's the problem. So he's just saying they're unstable. Iran, and I don't want to kick Iran, but they politically unstable. So no. The problem is the Israeli regime, which all of them need to be focused on.
That they should have, but the reason why Iran is a threshold state is because Iran has already been threatened with nuclear weapons. Hillary Clinton once threatened Iran. I remember an instance where she threatened Iran with nuclear weapons. The former French president threatened Iran with nuclear weapons. The Israeli regime has, during this genocide in Gaza, a minister threatened to use a nuclear weapon or propose using a nuclear weapon in Gaza. And different people have said that repeatedly. And then Netanyahu, he goes to the Israeli regime's nuclear site and threatens Iran from there, sending his own message. So being a threshold state has a purpose. It's basically saying, we don't have the weapon, but don't think you can threaten us with weapons. But if Iran is forced to have a weapon, they will have it. And I think what Dr. Larijani said, I think the most important sentence actually that he said was that whether you attack us or not, you cannot set back our nuclear program, meaning that you cannot set back our capability of producing a nuclear weapon. I don't even think that they can destroy the peaceful nuclear program because it's very deep underground. But the Iranians have been preparing themselves for war with the United States ever since 9/11. Ever since they went into Afghanistan and then into Iraq, the Iranians have been preparing themselves for war. And that's what all these underground missile bases and drone bases are about. And from what I've been hearing, the Iranians have put a lot of money into R&D, but also in order to make their drones and weapons more precise over the past 3-4 months. A lot of money is going into this from what I hear. So literally Iran has hundreds of thousands of missiles and drones that can destroy everything in the Persian Gulf region and far beyond. And so they have a conventional capability to deter any attack, to make it foolish. But they will develop a nuclear weapon, and the United States, from what Dr. Larijani has said, is in no position to stop it. So, but the reason why Dr. Larijani says this, as I'm sure you know, is to deter the United States. In other words, Iran is saying that, look, you behave normally. Well, the United States can't behave normally, but you refrain from taking the foolish step of attacking Iran. we won't make a nuclear weapon. But if you do, then we will. It's no longer what Dr. Kharozi said, another less senior advisor to the leader. He said 2 or 3 times that Iran will change its nuclear posture. No, Dr. Lari just said we will develop a nuclear weapon and you cannot set back our program.
Yeah.
So this is a new statement. Iran has pushed. I don't agree with those people who say Iran should develop a nuclear weapon now, and there are many in Iran who are saying it. Probably in the public is now in support of developing.
It's over now. No matter what the public say, no matter what you say, the supreme leader then said so now. That's like Kim Jong-un saying so. It's a fact that Iran will be nuclear if the U.S. shoot one missile. It's a fact that comes from the supreme leader. His word is the word, period. And the military, they're going to follow what he say. So he didn't say it. Trump that came out as the U.S. president, sent B-2 bombers that was nuclear. That was a fucking mistake. Talk that shit about destroying Iran, where they say if you do anything you thinking about doing, you're going to create a nuclear Iran, and then you're going to have to deal with that nuclear Iran.
Developing a nuclear weapon now. Before it was divided, I'm just guessing because I haven't seen recent polls. I've seen older polls. It's usually been near half and half. But under these circumstances, I would imagine that a substantial majority of Iranians believe we should develop a nuclear weapon now. But I am of that unpopular school that believes that what Dr. Larijani said is enough. And I think that was the proper position to take.
Well, the American intelligence agencies seem to agree, though, because they're all saying that Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon. On the other hand, Israel's been saying for the past 20 years that Iran is a few months away from a nuclear weapon. So I guess there's some disagreements there. However, if the United States would want to, I guess, reconsider what they did, withdrawing from the JCPOA, that is the nuclear deal, do you see any possibility of restoring that old agreement in that form which it was left, or how do you?
No, not in that form. The Iranian nuclear program has advanced a great deal since 2015. And especially since Trump left, because Iran shut down most of the program. And then when Trump left, Iran continued to abide by the JCPOA for a full year. And then after a year, Iran began to reduce its commitments gradually. And so after 2 years, since the Americans had left, the Iranians they fully restarted their program. But since then, they've been investing a lot in it. And partially in order to have leverage. That's why Iran, for example, produces enriched uranium at 60%. Some ask, why does Iran produce it when it doesn't have any use for it? I mean, we don't have a nuclear submarine yet, and we don't use it to produce medicine yet. So why do we have it? It's for leverage. It's to be used at the negotiating table when or if there are negotiations for a new deal at some point 5 years from now, if ever. So Iran's nuclear program has advanced a lot. Iran is not going to negotiate that, and it's not going to go backwards, especially since we've paid a huge price. The reason why we've developed the nuclear program is because of the maximum pressure sanctions. And the maximum pressure sanctions were never removed. Under Obama, some of the sanctions were eased, but he violated the deal from day one. And then he increasingly violated the deal more extensively until he left office, and then Trump tore up the deal. So that leads us to the other issue, and that is that in future, if Iran is ever going to negotiate with the United States, we will have to have assurances that they will not violate the deal. So it will be a very different type of deal if there is one in the future, where the Americans will be held accountable for violations, and where Iran's scientific advances won't be thrown out the window. We paid a price for them, so there's no reason whatsoever for Iran to do so. And also, the United States, when it threatens countries with nuclear weapons, when the Israeli regime threatens countries with nuclear weapons, then I think it's always the same thing to do, to make sure you do have that option. So we are where we are. I see any hope for a new nuclear deal to be very difficult to achieve. At the moment, the Iranians are being very strong. They're very firm. They're building up their defenses, and they're building up their offensive capabilities. And the messages that are being sent are that we're not going to talk with you directly. And so I think that shows that Iran is prepared.
So, well, so you said Iran has leverage, and there's an ability to use this in the negotiations in the future. What will be Iran's main, what it would want to achieve in a negotiation? And do you see any? Because in Europe now we're talking about how to have a wider reset or redo some of the mistakes we did over the past 30 years. Is there something similar to be done in that region? Something to, I guess, untangle some of the problems and conflicts which have been building up for so many years? Or I don't know how. I guess it's a bit difficult question how to fix this a huge riddle. But yeah. What would be the main approach?
We have to always keep in mind that the problem that the United States has with Iran is not about its nuclear program. It's not about human rights. It's not about global warming. It's not about terrorism. Everything is about the Israeli regime. That's how it has always been. And this is all about weakening Iran, weakening the region, so that the Israeli regime can continue with its ethno-supremacist ideology, and that it can expand its ethno-supremacist ideology. We now see that even though the Al-Qaeda regime in Syria is completely indifferent towards the Israeli aggression and the occupation of huge amount of territory in Syria, they're still bombing Syria. The Israelis are still bombing them. And there are reports that in the recent wave of bombings, they killed a number of Turkish officers. Turkey hasn't confirmed it, but there are those in Syria who say that a handful of Turkish officers were killed in the airstrikes. So they are ruthless. It's not just about the resistance. They are ruthless to everyone. It's not just about Gaza. They are carrying out ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. So how do you solve that problem? Because for Iran, the real issue is Israel. Everything else is just, minor. Our differences with the United States are over the fact that the United States and the Europeans, they are supporting an apartheid regime that is far more ruthless than the apartheid regime in South Africa. Something that Bishop Desmond Tutu himself said before this genocide, before the genocide in Gaza. He said after he visited Palestine that the apartheid regime in Palestine is far worse than in apartheid South Africa. So why should anyone in the West imagine that Iran will tolerate such a regime when the world did not tolerate apartheid in South Africa and, of course, Southern Africa, because it wasn't just South Africa?
This is a final question. What do you have any prediction which direction the region is moving in? Given we talked in the past, Israel has some very deep divides within its engaged in Gaza. It's committing terrible acts also in the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon. Well, there's no lack of Yemen. But where do you think this is heading? Because when it's having difficulties, it seems to be doubling down on its military adventurism. So Do you have any expectations, or informed guesses or prediction where this might be heading?
It's hard to say. We discussed this last time, as you rightly pointed out, and I don't like being so repetitive. But I think the real reason why there is a possibility for military conflict with Iran is the divide in Israel. I think it is because of their internal situation that they keep expanding the war. I think it's because of the internal conflict that they restarted the genocide in Gaza with Trump's green light, and that Trump is bombing Yemen, and that Israel is bombing Syria, and that they constantly attack Lebanon, and that they're carrying out more ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And it all has to do, at least partially, with the huge internal divide between the Ashkenazi Jews, the establishment Jews, and the rising rivals who are much more fanatical in their religious Zionist beliefs. So that has a lot to do with everything, and that I think that is the driving force, most probably, or a key driving force that pushes the United States and the regime itself towards war with Iran. Otherwise, as I've said before, the Israelis have lost this war. The biggest defeat has been the fact that they have been demolished in the eyes of they have no credibility. They are not seen as humane or human or civilized in the eyes of the world. That is something that will have huge consequences, and they will be permanent. It is like you or I, you being a professor with a certain degree of credibility in society, among your neighbors, among your students, among your colleagues, and then suddenly losing all of that permanently and being looked down upon as, or me looked down upon as some evil maniac. That I think is the worst thing that could happen to a person. I think my honor, my dignity, I think that, and that of my friends, that I think is more important to me than probably anything else on this planet, at least. So for the Israeli regime, I think that was the ultimate defeat, and it will have permanent consequences. And of course, they did not succeed on they've not taken Lebanon, they failed in Gaza after all this time. These are not victories; these are all defeats. Yemen. But I think so. None of this has been good for this regime. The regime would have been smart to, end this weeks after October the 7th. And I think a war with Iran would be the ultimate defeat. Some in Iran, actually, quite a few people in Iran, I can't say it's a majority, but quite a few people in Iran think that it's best to have a war, and that Iran will hit back very hard, and it will wreck the Western economy, and they will be blamed by the world, rightly so. And Iran is capable of hitting them so hard, destroying the oil and gas infrastructure, destroying everything that Qatar has, destroying everything that the Emirates has, destroying everything in the Arabian Peninsula, and also probably the Caucasus as well, and bringing Western economies to their knees. Many are saying that, and they think that we have to be strong and swift and hit very hard. So let them come. I don't like war. I fought as a volunteer in war for years. I would be willing to fight again tomorrow in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Palestine, in Iran, but I'm fundamentally against war.
Revolutionary salute to Alexis Bank for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love. It's a core figure that video you did on Jesse Miller and Lil Flip caught my attention. My nephew had a story to tell about her. He signed a Clover G for 3 days. Then Jesse Miller got him shot by the LA. What the hell? Hey, get with me on Cuff. I'm finna put my information in the chat so you can get with me immediately about this. Definitely will look into that. Appreciate the donation, and I appreciate you. All that's true. all that's true that I posted. Caused a bunch of controversy, but I didn't tell one lie. But revolution is a way of life. I'm finna put the information in the chat for you. Salute, Queen.
But I do believe that if there is war, the United States will lose. But the world will lose. Everyone will lose. Imagine the global economy, when it crashes, you will have hundreds of millions of people on the move. Right now what we're seeing, these immigrants or illegal immigrants or whatever they'd like to call them, refugees, it would be like a small creek, compared to a mighty river, if there is such a war, because the people who are on the move now they'll increase 100-fold as the global economy collapses. So it would be catastrophic. It would be utterly dystopian. Even though when we watch footage of Gaza, we already feel we live in a dystopian world. But what would become of life on this planet, I think, as a result of a war in the Persian Gulf, where all the palaces are glass palaces, I think that would make what's going on today look very small indeed.
Yeah, I wish Trump wouldn't take so lightly on making such huge and dangerous threats. It could destabilize the whole region just by his tweets. So anyways, Professor Marandi, I always enjoy talking to you. So thanks again.
Thank you, Glenn.
Who is joining us right now live wherever they are.
Yes, indeed. Everybody, be sure to hit the like button as you come on. Be sure to go to the video description. You can check out Brian's new Atlas YouTube channel after the program. You can also find all the ways to support this work there. But do hit the like button. That helps boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm. But we aren't going to waste any time here because, Brian, on this Liberation Day, on the day of reciprocal tariffs abound, a lot is being made of course, Trump's economic warfare. But in light of this, there has been a steady but intense buildup toward war, really on all fronts. But we must begin today with, first, Russia's response to these huge war threats that Donald Trump has been making. Brian, you may have heard that Donald Trump on March 30th said that if Iran doesn't make a deal, there will be bombing, and it will be bombing the likes of which they have never seen before. Sergei Ryabkov, Russia's deputy foreign minister, said there will be catastrophic consequences if Trump is to carry this out. Warships, though, however, the USS Carl Vinson is on its way to the region. We know that F-35s and B-2 bombers are all being stationed there right now. But Iran has not capitulated to these threats. This is what Ayatollah Ali Khamenei had to say in response to them.
The enmity from the US and Israel has always been there. They threaten to attack us, which we don't think is very likely. But if they do commit any mischief, they will surely receive a strong reciprocal blow.
So, Brian, things are intensifying on this front. Russia is now paying very close attention to this, especially in light of the fact that Russia has been slapped with new sanctions under Trump. What do you make of these developments, in particular, this war threat against Iran, even as Donald Trump is trying to so-called handle domestic priorities? What's your take on what's going on now in this world of war?
The first thing I think everybody should keep in mind is that all of these conflicts the U.S. is pursuing are all interconnected. if you look at Iran, what is Iran? It is one of the core pillars of multipolarism. They're trying to strike at and collapse Iran in order to collapse multipolarism. So we hear about President Donald Trump supposedly wanting peace with Russia, which at this point I think everybody can see through as laughable, as a transparent ploy that I think Russia saw through for the very first moment it began. But if you collapse multipolarism by trying to take out Iran as a pillar, you're collapsing it on the head of Russia and also China. At the same time, the U.S. is pursuing an expanded confrontation and perhaps war with China. So how could you be doing that to Iran and China and many other places as well, while supposedly making peace with Russia? It just doesn't add up at all. Now, this is part of an agenda that stretches back decades. The US, and before the US, the British Empire, were obsessed with controlling Iran. This goes way back. The US and the British Empire at one point did control Iran, and then the Iranian people rose up. They ousted the client regime, and they've been trying to defend that hard-fought sovereignty ever since. And so there's a lot of overlapping but related factors taking place right now. So the thing that I'm worried about, because I just heard Iranian leadership say that it's unlikely the U.S. will strike. I think if you look at what has been going on in the Middle East and around the globe, the U.S. is becoming increasingly desperate and obviously more dangerous. I mean, demonstrably more dangerous. You can see it. You can see it in their policies. The whole U.S. war on Russia via Ukrainian proxies is extremely dangerous and is continuing uninterrupted since President Trump took office. This U.S. war on Yemen right now, taking place right now. They're bombing Yemen right now. They just rearmed Israel. You know, this ceasefire, this wasn't a ceasefire. This was a pause to rearm Israel, to restart hostilities against the Palestinians. And they're mass murdering Palestinians right now. They're doing it very deliberately. This is a very deliberate provocation to keep the entire region on edge and pushing it over the cliff of regional conflict. And so all of this demonstrates dangerous desperation. And I don't think anybody should underestimate both the will of America to try to fight its way out of this corner it's unnecessarily painted itself into, and the level of death and destruction the U.S. is still capable of.
Yeah, what's interesting is that Donald Trump on Truth Social now has said that these reports are greatly exaggerated about the threat of war, even though it was him that actually said it. But nonetheless, what's been interesting, Brian, is that Iran hasn't backed down from these threats. Iran has stood pretty tall, and there were a lot of questions about Pezeshkian and the government, where they stood on things, but they have rejected direct talks with the United States under pressure, and said that they will hold indirect talks about any issue because Iran wants to alleviate sanctions. But there's been a lot of commentary because all of this is about Iran nuclear threat. What's your take on this? Because this is supposedly the source of enmity toward Iran, but you seem to be making a different argument. What's your assessment?
Yeah, well, it's all predicated on the supposed nuclear threat Iran poses. But as I've pointed out over many years, U.S. Corporate financier-funded think tanks, the actual interest driving U.S. foreign and domestic policy, for many years, they've said, if Iran were ever to acquire nuclear weapons, it would be only as a deterrent. Everything that they do is done in self-defense against what they admit is always a looming U.S. threat against the entire region. They admit this in their policy papers that are publicly published, just nobody reads them. The Rand Corporation and the Brookings Institution put out papers in 2009 going into this in depth, and they said that especially the Rand Corporation said that if Iran were ever to acquire nuclear weapons, they would be under the control of elite Iranian military units that already possess strategic weapons that Iran tightly controls. They do not proliferate these weapons across the region, and they don't use these offensively. They only use it as a deterrent. So if they were to acquire nuclear weapons, this is exactly what they would use them for, as a deterrent, as a defense against ever-looming U.S. aggression. Now, I hear people who are still trying to support the Trump administration make an oblique rationalization for what the Trump administration is doing, claiming that Iran's signed the non-proliferation treaty, and so this is a violation of it. And you have to understand the whole point of nuclear non-proliferation treaties is to not just eliminate nuclear weapons, but you have to eliminate the threats that drives a nation to acquire nuclear weapons. And all the United States has done is not only resist disarmament and reducing its own nuclear threat to the world, but it has a decade-spanning policy of military aggression all around the world. If you look at China and North Korea, their nuclear weapon program wasn't out of a desire to have nuclear weapons to enhance their ability to project power worldwide. It was in direct response to the threat, the real threat the U.S. posed. You have to remember, the U.S. is the only nation on planet Earth in human history to use nuclear weapons twice against Japan. And if you actually look at the circumstances they were used under, irrationally and unwarranted, there was no reason to use them except the U.S. wanted to demonstrate power and give Japan its their perceived comeuppance for daring to challenge U.S. hegemony in Asia Pacific. But that wasn't the only issue. If you look at American history following World War II, there were many instances where and it's now admitted, and you can see this in U.S. government historical documents, where they were considering using them during the Korean War, during the Vietnam War. They even considered using nuclear weapons in Afghanistan. I don't know if people remember that, but there was actually a moment where they decided they might use. So they didn't just use nuclear weapons. They're only nation to use nuclear weapons. They not only have them pointed at other nuclear armed nations, they have even considered using them against non-nuclear armed nations. And that is in combination with America's decade-spanning use of military aggression through conventional means against all nations on Earth. All nations on Earth face this threat. So this is what Iran is reacting to say they signed the treaty, so they have to stick to this treaty. It's like to make it real simple for people, it's like everyone signed a treaty to give up their handguns in a room full of people, and the U.S. is keeping their handgun. And not only that, they're going around the room shooting people randomly. And they said, if you try to pick up a gun and defend yourself, we'll shoot you sooner rather than later. But everyone is eventually going to get shot. So this is the logic that people labor under, trying to make that argument. I would say Iran would be irrational and radical for not wanting a nuclear deterrence at this point, considering what the United States has done over the decades and is still doing along and even still inside Iranian borders.
Yeah, when you're talking about the history of U.S. proliferation and threats of using nuclear weapons following their use of nuclear weapons, China, I think they were able to develop their first in 1964. I think they finished, but before that, they had been threatened with nuclear weapons multiple times by the United States in the Taiwan Straits crises, and the Korean War. So all that is to say is immediately China put up a no first use policy, and it still holds to this day. So it's not as if nuclear weapons can't be regulated, can't act as an effective deterrent, which they have for DPRK, for Russia, for China. So all that is to say, though, Brian, back to Iran, if a war were to begin between the United States and Iran, what would be these catastrophic consequences that Russia is talking about? Because it appears to me that the warning here is that these consequences will be far-reaching and not simply affecting Iran.
I mean, obviously, just one more thing I want to touch on, because I saw someone bring it up in the comment section, and I'm glad they did this. There was already a nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran, and it was under the Trump administration, where the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from it without any sort of real reason or evidence or basis. They just unilaterally withdrew. They said, this is not a good deal and we're withdrawing from it. And I just want to point out that in the 2009 Brookings Institution paper, Which Path to Persia, they even said, they proposed making a deal with Iran, deliberately sabotaging it, blaming its collapse on Iran, and using that as a pretext to place additional economic and military pressure on Iran, which is literally and exactly what the Trump administration did. It was a two-part plan that began under the Obama administration, was handed off to the Trump administration. They both played their parts in cooperation with one another, not in opposition of each other. And now the Trump administration, who unilaterally walked away from the previous nuclear deal, is demanding that Iran sign another deal with this obviously unhinged, unreliable, untrustworthy party, the United States. And under what authority is the U.S. demanding all of this of Iran in the first place? Who designated them the party to pursue this with Iran? Nobody. So again, people have to, go to square one with this and see if this adds up even from the beginning, and it doesn't. Now, Danny, you're talking about what are the consequences of a war with Iran. I mean, you could already look at what U.S. war all across the Middle East has done to the world, and the destabilization that it causes in terms of populations shifting, people fleeing by the millions from these conflicts, the damage that it does economically. The Middle East is decades and decades behind where it should actually be if it was just left alone and allowed to develop along its natural, the natural course of things. And Iran is a hydrocarbon producer. They produce and export energy. China is a consumer of this energy. And so this isn't just some, I see a lot of people say, the U.S. is doing this because of Israel. The U.S. and before that, the British Empire were obsessed with Iran before there was an Israel. So this is about many things. It's about, we cannot tolerate an independent nation with an independent foreign policy in a region we want primacy over. This is also about confining, isolating, cutting off China from hydrocarbons, and confining it geopolitically within its borders before moving in on China itself. Iran is a close ally of Russia as well. So this is, again, like I said in the beginning, these are all interconnected conflicts. Attacking Iran is also part of undermining both Russia and China. So these are the consequences for Russia and China directly, but also for the global economy. Everybody's going to be affected. The Strait of Hormuz, all the energy that transits, that the ability of a spreading conflict across the region between the U.S. and Iran, affecting energy infrastructure outside of Iran, is a very real possibility. So it could spiral out of control. Everybody knows that Israel supposedly has nuclear weapons. They're an irrational actor in the region. They are. If Ukraine were to survive 30, 40, 50 years and enjoy lots of success and support from the U.S., that's what Ukraine would look like. And look at the damage Ukraine is already causing. This is what Israel's already doing. Plus, they have nuclear weapons. So tremendous danger. I don't think catastrophic. Using the word catastrophic is hyperbole at all.
Yeah, and I think Russia understands too that if this were to happen, it would be so damaging that it'd be in large part because unlike perhaps the 2003 invasion of Iraq, 2001 war in Afghanistan, Iran has capabilities, and those capabilities could very much lead to, regardless of what you think, will Iran win, won't Iran win? I don't think it even matters. Iran has the capabilities to defend itself to the extent that we get to this point of, well, Israel has 100+ nuclear weapons. The United States is bombing Yemen, but bombing Iran probably it would be very difficult to undertake a so-called successful operation there of regime change, hence why Iran is still around today. So there is, I think, a lot of consequences to this that will explode, and not just in the faces of the multipolar world, because it would be extremely damaging for Russia, for China, for especially Iran, but it would be damaging to the United States, to Israel. It has far-reaching consequences, and I'm not so sure Donald Trump fully understands when he so glibly talks about bombing Iran. Your thoughts?
I would just warn people against underestimating America's capacity, again, to cause death and destruction, to topple nations that we all thought were, not untouchable, but probably would have resisted collapse by the U.S. Remember Syria. I mean, Syria is the biggest warning for everybody. This was a country that we saw the U.S. Array all of its abilities and assets against in an attempt to topple the government there. Starting in 2011, alongside other nations, the U.S. already toppled. Libya is a good example. And not only did Syria prevail initially, Russia and Iran, they came to Syria's aid. They were in Syria. The Russian military was in Syria, or Iran was in Syria. And so in a lot of people's minds, and I'm not going to deny, in my mind also, I believe that Syria's position was relatively stable. And I underestimated America's ability to persist and eventually succeed in regime change there. They did. And the way they did it was by overextending Russia and Iran elsewhere, limiting their ability to deal with this knockout blow that they delivered finally in December of last year. And so if Russia and Iran are overstretched to the point where they could not keep the Syrian government in power, if they were unable to stop this knockout blow, it kind of makes you wonder where else they might be overextended, to what extent they're overextended, and what the U.S. might be able to do to complicate things further for Russia and Iran elsewhere, outside of their borders, but also within their borders. So we have to be very careful about that. Yes, Iran has capabilities. We have seen those capabilities against U.S. bases across the region, against Israel itself. We've seen the attempts by Israel to carry out strikes against Iran, and there's some questions about how successful they were. I think if they were,
I don't know if you've seen the videos, Brian, of Iran, the Iranian military, IRGC, at least the IRGC portion, but Iran has been posting videos on the regular since these threats have emerged, of their massive underground missile cities, testing their air defense systems, which we were told, Brian, that they were all gone. Israel had hit them. They were destroyed. All of Russia's gifted weapons were gone. It seems like that's not the case. So that's where I think this is where the complicated issue of what happens if there is an actual confrontation. It could get quite messy.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. And we see the U.S. is pulling out all the stops as B-2 stealth bombers. These are supposedly invisible to radar or less visible to radar. But we have seen weapon systems like this fail elsewhere. I mean, I think people remember the stealth fighter, the F-117 that was downed while bombing Serbia. And we have to remember that until the Syrian government collapsed and the military fled, the U.S. and Israel were reduced to using their stealth F-35 fighters, fifth generation warplanes, using them with standoff strikes, which means the planes never came in range of Syria's integrated air defense system. So if that's their problem with Syria, isn't that also going to be a problem with Iran? And as you pointed out, it's just the claim that Israel knocked out all of Iran's air defense systems in one or two strikes is absurd, just at face value. So yes, I think there's a little bit of underestimating on both sides of this conflict.
Yeah, and the one thing I'm a politics guy, geopolitics guy. So are you, but you also have a deep knowledge of kind of military arsenals, weapons, these kind of things. You've done a lot around that. I'll throw out the politics part, and I want you to talk about the capabilities part, because for me, Syria, we didn't know that it was such a defeated nation at that time. Like the government was defeated. There's even many of these former ministers inside of the Bashar al-Assad government that have stayed in power and have taken the orders and jobs given to them by the HTS. So it was defeated, and there was very little blood. At least there's very little bloodshed in the final takeover of the government. Now, Iran doesn't seem defeated. Iran seems they're pushing back hard. They're showing off their weapons. They're saying they're going to build nukes if they need them. They're going to have reciprocal blows. So on that level, I see some big problems for the United States in getting into a huge quagmire if this were to really jump off into a strikes campaign. But perhaps you can talk about this contrast between the U.S.'s capabilities, which have been diminished by Ukraine, and Iran's capabilities, which they really haven't been tested. They tested them in Operation True Promise 1 and 2, but they haven't really been tested in battle. Like they're certainly not, at least from apparently, it doesn't seem like they're lacking the ability. So your thoughts on this contrast here?
Well, and we've talked about this over the last year or so. Iran's biggest strategic deterrence right now is its long-range missile arsenal. This is something that they have spent years and years developing. We saw them use these missiles in the aftermath of the U.S. assassination, murder of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. This was during the first Trump presidency, by the way. It was an absolute, utter act of war. I always hear people say President Trump never started any new wars. He didn't end any wars, but he didn't start any new wars. It wasn't for a lack of trying. He did. He desperately tried to start a war with Iran during his first administration. We saw Iran use these missiles on U.S. bases. The U.S. was given a warning before Iran struck these bases. And so they had their air defense, their missile defenses should have been active and ready, and they failed to intercept these missiles. We watched Israel fail to intercept these missiles, and we have watched over the last 3 years the collective West bleed dry their air and missile defense capabilities as they funneled them into Ukraine, where they've been exhausted and also destroyed. So what exactly do they have left? And I saw news reports that the U.S. was moving air defense and missile defense systems from Asia Pacific to the Middle East, specifically to get ready for this operation. But you have to remember, they do not have the ability to rapidly replace these capabilities. So even if they work 100%, they exhaust their missile stockpiles, they're not going to be able to build them up faster than a nation like Iran, Russia, or China can build the missiles and other threats that they're supposed to defend against. We have watched this play out in Ukraine. So that is the biggest problem I think the collective West faces. You have to remember also that it's very difficult to overthrow a nation by just bombing, and we've watched the U.S. do this over many decades, attempting to bomb nations into submission. This is very difficult to do. But we have to remember the U.S. also has a lot of assets on the ground in Iran, along Iranian borders. The overthrow of Syria and now turning it into a breeding ground for extremism. This is exactly what they did in Libya. And then from Libya, they spread out across North Africa and also to the Middle East. They literally exported terrorists from Libya to Syria to continue fighting the war there. So it's a little bit more complicated, but I think people imagining that just one air campaign against Iran somehow is going to cripple or collapse the Iranian government. I mean, unless they use nuclear weapons, but wouldn't that be the ultimate irony that they're saying we have to stop Iran because they're going to use nuclear weapons, and then the U.S. ends up using nuclear weapons on Iran. But again, at this point, the U.S. is so desperate and so dangerous, you really cannot rule that out. And then what will the world's reaction be to that? I can't even fathom what the world would do in reaction to that. But we're at a very dangerous juncture where it becomes difficult to predict what will happen because the U.S. has become so irrational. And we could talk about this vis-a-vis China, this idea that the U.S. wants to maintain hegemony over the planet, despite being 4 or 5% of the global population, and the balance of power decisively shifting away from the collective West. I mean, that is irrational to begin with. So everything that follows from that becomes detached further and further from reality, becomes more and more dangerous.
Yeah, and I believe in large part that's why you have Russia, Iran, China, in their leadership. They're really calling Trump and the United States on their bluff, because there's so many threats happening. There's so much provocations. And at this point, it appears on all ends, and we're going to move to Ukraine now, that all three of them, these big powers, they're fed up with this treatment, because it's only escalating further and further. And I wanted to get to this point about Ukraine, Brian, because Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Ryabkov, he had more words to say. It's been a busy time for him. He said something I think very important that a lot of people may be missing right now. Russia cannot accept U.S. ceasefire proposal in Ukraine. He says, while we take Americans' proposed models and solutions very seriously, we can also not accept them as is. And he talks about this in response to these comments that Donald Trump made. And this is from Meet the Press. They talk about these comments about Trump being pissed off potentially at Vladimir Putin.
Just hours ago, President Trump called me to tell me he is, quote, pissed off with Russia's President Putin and threatened to impose secondary tariffs on Russia's oil. Quote, if Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if I think it was Russia's fault, I am going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia.
So we can stop it there, Brian. This is the state of things. Russia has said, this ceasefire, it's not very serious. The energy ceasefire, Ukraine is constantly hitting Russian energy facilities. There's also the fact that Ukraine is now doing some kind of incursion into Belgorod. The fighting continues. The solutions by Donald Trump that are being proposed are just non-starters for Russia. What do you make of these comments by Sergei Ryabkov and what they say about the current state of Ukraine in the conflict?
Well, first of all, the Trump administration is talking about secondary sanctions. This was the dream of the Biden administration, was to apply, force countries like India to stop dealing in Russian oil, because the sanctions against Russian oil were a complete failure. And so this was something that the U.S. as an establishment wanted to do all along. And this is just the Trump administration making public excuses for pursuing these options. You remember, Danny, we were talking about U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth giving the U.S. directive to Europe, saying, we're not ending this war. We just need to pause it. We need to freeze it. You guys need to build up your military. You got to double that. He said, literally double down on supporting Ukraine, giving them weapons and other support to continuously build them up. They needed to buy time because they were losing the proxy war. That was so transparent. And he said this publicly. Everybody saw this. It was posted on the Department of Defense's website. So under what circumstances would Russia ever fall for this? It was so obviously an attempt to create a Minsk III framework plus a Syria-style buffer zone using Western troops in Ukraine, what's left of Ukrainian territory, to freeze the conflict, because what the U.S. is realizing is that it's incapable of fighting Russia, Iran, and China. It needs to pause this proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. It is a U.S. war against Russia. I continuously hear people talk about how the U.S. is mediating peace between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainians and the Europeans are sabotaging President Trump's attempts to make peace with Russia. This is a U.S. war 100%, it is a U.S. war. Everyone involved is involved because the U.S. has coerced them into being involved. There are a series of articles. We've been covering this for 3 years now, from the New York Times especially, detailing how from 2014 onward, not from 2022 onward, from 2014 onward, it was not just the political capture of Ukraine, it was the institutional, military, and intelligence capture of Ukraine. The CIA moved into Ukraine. They were building bases all along the border with Russia. They control absolutely everything. Ukraine's military and intelligence agencies are doing it as an extension of the US. This is a US war against Russia fought through Ukraine so that the US isn't directly at war with Russia. So as we have said, at any time of President Trump's choosing, he can end this war. People doubt that he could end it in 24 hours. It's almost literally he could end it in 24 hours if he wanted to. He doesn't want to. This is all about pressuring, coercing, and cornering Russia into agreeing to a ceasefire that obviously wouldn't benefit Russia and would, again, be a Minsk III, just buying time so that the U.S. can rearm, reorganize, and push again at a later date when the factors favor them. This is exactly what they did in Syria, and it worked. So you can't blame them for wanting to try it again in Ukraine. So obviously Russia isn't going to fall for this. And because they're not falling for this, now we hear the threats of sanctions. The stick is out. I don't think they really had any carrots. There was maybe the illusion of carrots, but now they've got the stick out, and now they're telling, and they're going to make it out as if, and we predicted this, as if it's Russia's fault. We want peace, but Russia doesn't want peace. So very predictable, but that is exactly what is happening. That's why the proxy war is going to continue. And just think about it. The U.S. destroyed its own ceasefire in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. It is threatening war with Iran. It made a deal with Iran. It walked away from the deal with Iran. It's threatening war with Iran if they don't make another deal. And they're doing this military buildup with China, one of Russia's closest allies. So why would Russia buy into any of this? So yes, very predictable, and that is where we are right now.
Well, Russia's watched too, just in the last several months, Lebanon ceasefire, Gaza ceasefire, all of these deals that the United States has been in the center of, the so-called mediator of. They've all been not worth if there's any paper written, they're not worth the paper they're written on, because they completely collapsed without even a word from the Trump administration about resisting this or enforcing this at all. So it's a complete and utter sham at this point, and this is where I believe it's being exposed more and more that this so-called peace process is not that. And Sergei Ryabkov, in those comments that I pulled up, he also said in this interview, it was an interview for a magazine, he said not just that they're taking these talks seriously, but they're not impressed with the ceasefire. He said explicitly the Trump administration, the United States, has given zero indication about ending the war. No indication. So it's Russia saying there hasn't been any indication that they truly want to end the conflict, Brian. And that gets to in terms of what's happening, have you been following the battlefield situation at all? Because now we have incursion in Belgorod by Ukraine, constant energy strikes. But at the same time, Russia doesn't seem too concerned, which means even though all of the accountability and really a lot of the benefits can only go to Ukraine and the United States for ending this conflict, they're not doing it. So what do we make of this, given the battlefield situation, Brian?
But as my friend and colleague Angelo Giuliano always points out, would President Trump even be talking about making peace with Russia if the U.S. was winning this proxy war? The answer is no. They're losing the proxy war. We covered it for 3 years. We watched the U.S. fail in this proxy war against Russia. And we could discuss how the plan always was just to overextend Russia, not necessarily defeat Russia through Ukraine. But I think they always had it in mind that there is a possibility that a collapse could take place, so that maybe they would get lucky and Russia would reach a breaking point. But they haven't. They haven't done that. The proxy war is on the verge of just completely collapsing. What we've been seeing on the battlefield, which we were talking about and predicting for 3 years, was that this was a war of attrition. Russia was deliberately whittling away at Ukraine's combat power, but also at the same time emptying the collective stockpiles of the US and Europe and other US proxies, to the point where Ukraine is losing more combat power than they can reconstitute. It would begin a process of crumbling locally along the line of contact before the entire line of contact would start to collapse. And so right now we're seeing locally all along the line of contact areas that are just collapsing. And these were areas that were some of the most heavily fortified positions. We remember Avdiivka from 2014 onward, that was a fortress that Ukraine held, and now they don't. And not only that, Russia pushed so quickly and rapidly past Avdiivka. Now they're surrounding Pokrovsk, and we were told that Ukraine's going to stop them there, but we see that crumbling. We saw. Right now we're watching Chasiv Yar being overrun by Russian forces. The Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. We were told that this was this was a card Ukraine would use in negotiations, trade to Russia in return for their own territory back. They've been pushed out of Kursk, and we reported on this too. They sent their best troops, their best equipment into Kursk, where it was just completely destroyed. It was just wasted away, and now the line of contact faces collapse. And we saw in Syria, if you hollow out a military and a state to a large enough degree, there could be a general collapse where you don't actually have to fight for every single inch of territory that you gain. Eventually, the lines will collapse and you'll just be able to push forward. And so this is what I think the United States and their European proxies, this is what they're worried about. This is what they want to try to prevent. And in the process, again, like I said, they want to try to corner Russia into a ceasefire that doesn't benefit Russia at all and will preserve Ukraine as this pressure point, this leverage, this constant national security, I would say existential threat to Russia in play as they move other pieces around the globe to encircle, contain, undermine, and destroy multipolarism elsewhere.
Yeah, and I see a lot of this too, Brian, as not having, a lot of people have been saying, using the term cards. It seems like, the United States doesn't really have any cards to play here. It's either give Russia what it wants, those terms, which maybe you can discuss, or do this, which is, play nice. I think it's playing at diplomacy, because when you actually get to the substance, well, there's nothing really diplomatic about this if you're just floating non-starter ceasefires that repeat exactly as you said, the Minsk kind of model. But playing nice and then doing exactly what's happening. So that's kind of how I see it. But how do you see it?
Yes, I mean, again, since President Trump took office, I was telling people that there's no genuine attempt to strike any sort of peace with Russia. It was never in the cards. The United States has never done this. The Trump administration itself has a history, an established history of not just breaking deals in general with other nations, but breaking deals and even signed treaties with Russia itself. He was the one who walked away from a nuclear arms control treaty with Russia. And then when you look at the history of the U.S. in general regarding Russia, there were the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements. And it was admitted in hindsight that this was just a ploy to buy time because Ukraine was losing. They want to stretch this out for as long as possible. And so that is exactly what they continue to do, to think somehow, suddenly, not just the U.S. in general, but President Trump and the neocons that he has surrounded himself with, again, voluntarily, to think that somehow suddenly he would just genuinely desire peace with Russia is just so far-fetched and fantastical. I just don't understand it at all. And we have to remember, there's also this dynamic where the U.S. would like to put distance between Russia and China. In their mind, they think that this is plausible or possible. And so there's a degree of that at play too. And I don't think that they think they can trick Russia into doing it, but I think they believe with enough military and economic coercion, again, they could kind of push Russia into a corner involuntarily. Russia wouldn't want to be in this corner, but they could use the, as you say, the cards that they have to try to kind of corner them into a situation where they have to at least partially agree to a ceasefire, or at least back down a little bit in a way, with this energy infrastructure ceasefire, 30-day. I mean, we kind of understand that it's really not that significant, but the fact that Russia, to a certain degree, feels like it has to go along with this to not appear disinterested in diplomacy, kind of substantiates that theory. So, no, I mean, it was never about peace. It's about buying time so that the U.S. can continue doing exactly what it's always been doing. To understand what the U.S. is doing in terms of geopolitics, you have to understand the special interests that are driving. These are unelected corporate monopolies that have run the United States for generations now. And, you might vote for a different president, someone new might come into office, but these interests are not elected. They're always, in office. They're always producing policy papers, which are transformed into bills, which go to Washington with lobbyists to get signed off on both sides of the aisle. So until that changes, nothing else about U.S. policy is going to change. And the only change that we see is the rise of multipolarism is forcing that policy to change and react to. That is the only factor that's going to change America's behaviors. I really don't think that there's any possibility of change within the United States until people identify these corporate monopolies as the problem and devise a solution to deal with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a couple of developments too came to mind as you were talking about this larger framework for how the United States is, how geopolitics, as they are enacted upon by the United States, those interests, what drives U.S. foreign policy. It makes me think J.D. Vance in Greenland talking to the troops and literally saying Russia and China, this is the reason why the United States needs to take over Greenland, because Denmark is doing a poor job keeping them safe from Russia and China's naval buildup, literally calling them enemies. And then the DNI comes out, Tulsi Gabbard's DNI comes out with the threat assessments. And while a lot of intelligence folks who come out who are, pro-peace, and they're very good people, they say, well, this is just paper. This is just very sloppy and repeating things. Sure. But what it's repeating is that Russia is still an enemy. Russia is the enemy of so you're negotiating with Russia. You're saying you say you want peace and to stop the killing. And yet you have the intelligence apparatus, which I thought was dead. I thought the deep state was gone. But they're saying that Russia is a principal threat of the United States and that it needs to be curbed, curtailed, and contained. It seems like there's a lot to sift through here, Brian, but the overall theme is that Russia is still the enemy, even though there are these talks going on.
I think it would be inappropriate for me to say I told everyone so. So I'm not going to do that. But what I will say is you're absolutely right about all of that. It was predicted that when they started producing these documents under the Trump administration, the National Defense Strategy and all of this, that Russia and China would still be on the list as enemies. And so all of this that we heard during the campaign and the first couple of weeks in office, this was all just blatant lying to the American people and to the global public, to leaders around the world, governments around the world. And it was warned that the Trump administration is driving policy based on Project 2025, which was produced by the Heritage Foundation, which is funded by all of these corporations that I just was talking about, these corporate monopolies that run U.S. foreign domestic policy. Literally every single thing the Trump administration has done so far, you can find in Project 2025. Everything from, and you have to read it carefully, they did not dismantle the deep state. They consolidated it. They streamlined it. They are sharpening these tools. They're not dismantling any of them. They said, we've abolished USAID. They took 1,000, and this is Secretary of State Marco Rubio admitting this, 1,000 programs from USAID, and they simply consolidated it under the State Department. They're doing the same thing with their propaganda arm, the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm here in Southeast Asia at the receiving end of US interference, and I am telling you that I can see that none of this has stopped. It has not been interrupted, even in the slightest. The dirty war the US is fighting against Myanmar using all of these tools continues unabated. And I warned about all of these people that President Trump was filling his cabinet up with. I warned people, and I had people tell me, no, he's got Tulsi Gabbard, as if, even if she was legitimate anti-war or whatever people imagine her to be, she's just one person in an administration full of neoconservative establishment warmongers who have a public record going as far back as they've ever been involved in politics, supporting every single war that has come along. I remember J.D. Vance, before President Trump entered into office, he was talking about, we want to, not that he wanted to end the war in Ukraine, he was basically saying, push it onto Europe because we need these weapons to fight a war with China. And it's just, how do you hear that and then draw the conclusion that the US wants peace or that the US is opposed to the deep state? War with China is the deep state's #1 priority. So the Trump administration making that, it's openly making that its #1 priority, tells you its relationship to the so-called deep state. It is directly serving it. It's not even a really good act when you actually turn your emotions off and look objectively at the facts. Danny, did you see Tulsi Gabbard, who's now the director of national intelligence, calling President Donald Trump the peace president? This was within the last week. I'm pretty sure she posted this on X that he is the peace president
in the Middle East.
Even as President Trump is ordering the bombing of Yemen after he just gave Israel hundreds of 2,000-pound bombs to bury the Palestinians with, and as they array military forces against Iran. So these people think that you are dumb, and I think that you're not dumb. And I just ask and beg people to please, who do you want to prove wrong? Do you want to prove me wrong, or do you want to prove these people who are lying to your face and doing the exact opposite of what they promised? Who do you want to prove is right and wrong?
Yeah. And one final comment, Brian, on Ukraine, if you will.
Sure.
There's the New York Times. Where is it now? The New York Times has, see it right there. Well, the New York Times ran a report about the battlefield situation. They reference an offensive, and I'm not sure. I'm curious about your thoughts as Putin keeps pushing with Trump on the battlefield. The Russian leader's drones are deluging Ukrainian cities, while his negotiating tactics test the patience of the friendliest White House he has faced in decades. I'm just going to scroll down to their reference. Russian forces are preparing to launch yet another large-scale offensive, Ukrainian commanders have warned, amid intense fighting across the front. Putin, far from seeing the conflict has reached a standstill, is boasting his army is preparing to finish off the Ukrainian military, which he made these comments to a submarine crew. So, Brian, what offensive are they referring to? And your final thoughts on the situation regarding Ukraine, because even the Western mainstream media, while they claim Trump is just ultra friendly to Russia, they're admitting that the situation is far from static. There is no ceasing of hostilities. There's still heavy fighting. So where is this offensive going?
Well, as far as I can tell, what Russia is going to do is just continue the war of attrition that it has been waging against Ukraine this entire time. And they will continue because they understand that these overtures of peace are a facade, is disingenuous. There's no genuine interest in peace, just pausing it and creating a headache for Russia further down the line. The only way Russia will ever agree to any sort of ceasefire or pause or slowing down is if they think they can use that time better than the collective West can. If they feel that they're being overextended and they need to regroup and reorganize, and they can use that time better than the collective West can, then maybe they'll agree to it. I'm almost certain that is what Russia did with Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. I don't really think that they genuinely fell for it. I think they weren't prepared to carry out the special military operation then, and they felt that they could use the time better than the collective West did. And if we look at the results of the special military operation, I think it's not hard to see how that logic flowed and how it has benefited Russia. But yes, I think if the fighting continues, it's because Russia doesn't buy this, not even for a moment. And this continuation of undermining Ukraine's military to collapse it, essentially, that is the ultimate goal. And that is how Russia will actually, if you want peace in Ukraine, because the US has no interest in it, you have to make peace by winning on the battlefield. So this is what Russia would have to do. If they really want permanent peace in Ukraine, they're going to have to finish this on the battlefield. So maybe that's what they're referring to. There was another part of the question there. I can't remember what it was.
Well, in response to this, Brian, I mean, what is going on? It's pretty clear what's going on here, that Russia has not fallen for the trap. They've essentially, in the most diplomatic and most astute, I mean, I've been very impressed actually with Russia's handling of all of this, because not only have they given up anything, they're not giving nothing up to the United States right now, but they're also, on the one hand, engaging in this process because, well, if you have a very unstable regime that is willing to slander and smear you and do anything it can to knock you off in terms of your legitimacy worldwide, Russia's been doing this since the beginning. They have engaged in the most astute kind of diplomacy since before the Trump administration throughout this conflict. And they're continuing it here. And yet, militarily, Putin has made several strong messages. The entire government has been very strong on this is just going to continue. And in many ways, they have this public kind of incentive to do so, because people don't want to see it end. At least that's the word I'm getting in Russia, is that unless Russia's terms are satisfied, perhaps you can talk about those, like, why would the fighting stop? Why give up? People have died. There are principles to this. It's not as if this is simply fighting for fighting's sake. There's a lot at stake here for Russia, and to simply give it up would be, and really, it would be kind of national suicide and political suicide.
That national suicide for sure, because that's what the whole goal of this proxy war was. It is to overextend Russia and eventually precipitate its collapse. And so we're talking about the existence of the Russian Federation and the people within it, everyone within it, not just the political order running the nation state. And so this is existential for Russia. They've understood this all along. And you're exactly right, Danny. They're playing along. They if there was a way to resolve this diplomatically, of course, they would want to do that. But they know that the United States is not genuinely interested in peace. But for a multitude of reasons, they have to appear to be going along with it. They don't want to appear undiplomatic. This would complicate their own situation, their relations with their allies, even though I believe nations like China or Iran, and they understand perfectly well what Russia is going through, because the US is doing the same thing to them. But publicly, internationally, they all have to appear to prefer diplomacy over war. And I think that they do prefer diplomacy over war, but they understand the reality that This has to be solved on the battlefield. The situation in Syria had to be solved on the battlefield. And because it wasn't, we can see what the outcome of that conflict actually was. Now, going back to the New York Times article, Danny, that you showed, claiming that the Trump administration is the friendliest White House Russia has had in years, that would be like saying the Obama administration was friendly with Russia because remember Secretary of State Hillary Clinton did that whole reset with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. It was all theater, just like what the Trump administration is doing right now is all 100% theater. When you look at the fundamentals, nothing has changed between then and now. It is all the same. So it is obviously theater. And we remember Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov laughing and smiling and holding the fake reset button that they were pushing together with Hillary Clinton. I don't think that they were like, yes, finally, we're going to be friends with America. I think they understood what was going on. If you were following Russian military developments, that entire time, they were building up a military specifically for this conflict in Ukraine, for conflict in Ukraine, for conflict in the Arctic region. This is what they were preparing for. And because they knew we're not making peace with the United States, especially not with the Obama administration, especially not with someone like that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. So people have to keep all of that in mind. They have to look at history and remember what has happened and look at things now and look past the rhetoric and the political left-right divide. It's a distraction. It's a smokescreen. Look behind it. Look at the fundamentals. And if nothing has changed, then there's no reason for Russia to think anything has changed, and there's no reason for Russia to change course on what it's doing. It faces an existential threat in Ukraine in the shape of the U.S. and NATO waging this proxy war, and they need to win it.
Yeah, and I'll say this too: Russia is going to it will secure any concessions the United States makes on the diplomatic front. With the knowledge, because there are moves to, I think there may be a visit, perhaps by Russian diplomats soon to Washington. There was, of course, the whole Black Sea deal that was seen as, one way that Russia could actually agree diplomatically to something with the United States. But all of this is going to be done very piecemeal and amount to probably just basic small gains on the diplomatic front. Some might say they're big if, for example, embassies are reopened in both countries. But at the same time, it's all going to be done in lieu of the fact that there's actually a war still going on between these two countries, and there really is no effective normalization and diplomacy between two countries when they're actually at war. So that those two things cannot exist together. And that is why, even if there are these small gains and it looks different, and it might even be different for a moment in the medium term, in the medium to long term, it's not different because if there's a war still going on and the United States is not willing to concede defeat to that war, which is just a reality of the situation, and that war still exists, then there is no real diplomatic thaw. There is no real normalization between the two countries. And we haven't even gone to, Brian, the fact that Trump, the administration, and the Republicans in majority, they just pushed through more sanctions on Russia. So it's not as if these small gains are not coming also at costs. Weapons flows, sanctions still happening. It's in a lot of ways, it's a mess, and it's important to come to terms with that mess. And the mess falls at the feet again of the United States, which has every power within it. Maybe it doesn't have the interests, maybe it doesn't have the ability in terms of U.S. foreign policy designs and how the system works, but everything falls at the feet of the United States, and it's a mess right now. They're not doing it. Your final comments.
No, it's a really good point to make. Just think about it. This whole war with Russia that the U.S. has engineered, this was all being done while Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, was shaking hands, smiling, and pushing a reset button Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. So if that's what the U.S. was doing when all the embassies were open and relations were, superficially relative to today much better, it doesn't really matter. So it really is. It's all just window dressing. It's entirely superficial. The United States has not changed its overall objective of pursuing primacy over the world. It does not want partnership with anyone around the world. It wants primacy over the world, and it continues to pursue this policy. As I continuously say, they are becoming desperate, and as they become desperate, they become dangerous. So they can superficially say, "Oh, we're repairing all of our ties with Russia," but if the ultimate goal remains the same, they're at each day that goes by that they're becoming weaker, and they still desperately desire this ultimate objective. The bigger the risk and the threat is to Russia. It really doesn't matter what superficially the diplomatic situation is. It's still tremendously dangerous. And I generally would say it's better that Russia and the U.S. are talking to each other. It's better if the embassies are open. I wouldn't say that it's not at least a small thing that is good. But again, you have to go back to fundamentals. You have to look at what is actually really happening. And you have to use that as a basis to draw a conclusion whether this is the vector sum of all of this is going in a positive or negative direction. I'd say it's still speeding dangerously downward.
Now, if Tony Benn was my political father, our first guest is my political son. I love him. He's Jackson Hinkle, the one and only. They seek him there, they seek him here, they seek him everywhere. He's the Scarlet Pimpernel, and my goodness, he cuts a dash. Jackson, welcome back to the show. Been too long. Where are you now? Are you able to say? Because I saw you were in Pyongyang. You made a magnificent speech in Sana'a in Yemen, where the bombers were overhead. You're traveling the world and doing God's work. Tell us, what's in Jackson Hinkle life now?
Well, it's a great honor to be here, George. I am currently located in Moscow, Russia, safe from the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. Although I've done nothing wrong, you never know what they're going to do, because they're going up and rounding up innocent people who are simply voicing their opposition to the wars in the Middle East right now, and they're deporting them, or they're saying that this is somehow illegal. It's really crazy what's going on. But Sana'a was beautiful. Yemen was a great country to visit. It really opened my eyes to many things, and it was an honor to be there. But I would be lying if I didn't say that I don't have the same level of courage as those Yemenis, and I am happy to be out of the line of sight of American B-2 bombers and F-15s that were taken off from the USS Harry Truman and Diego Garcia. Now that I'm here in Moscow.
Well, don't be shy about that. I myself have been bombed twice, and I'm ready to tell anyone there can be no more terrifying experience than literally to be pressing your nose into the ground, hoping that your profile is sufficiently slim that you're not going to be struck by the shards of red-hot steel that fly around. So I'm very glad that you're back and safe. Let's start with what's happening in the United States. You alluded to it. They are literally rounding people up. It's a kind of fascism. People are being told to self-deport if they know that their social media contains criticisms of Israel. They should self-deport. And if they don't, they'll be huckled in the street by masked men, lots of masked men, even if they are a little girl from Turkey, from Tufts University, surrounded by men whose faces she could not see, who produced no documentation, who handcuffed her and took her away. I was waiting for the shot in the back of her head. I thought it was a scene from Syria, from ISIS, Al-Qaeda controlled Syria. What on earth is happening in what used to call itself the land of the free?
It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. It's really a complete attack on free speech by the so-called pro-free speech, Make America Great Again movement. And I will say that there's many within the MAGA movement who are opposed to what's happening. The genuine organic roots of the MAGA movement are opposed to what's happening. But there's so many fakes and fraudsters. And then, of course, at the top, you have someone who is the least MAGA of all, Donald Trump and the Kushners and all these ilk who are really they're couldn't be further from the embodiment of what the true spirit of MAGA is. And the most important thing, as Ron Paul always says, is we have to protect free speech. The last speech that Ron Paul gave on the U.S. House floor was about the need to protect free speech. And now we see today just how important that is. I'll say, just briefly, it's baffling to me and disgusting that our government is deporting people, lawful residents, even green card holders, over their opinions against Israel and in support of the resistance, because it was the United States who had a very similar founding. My ancestors came to America on the Mayflower. They fought in the American Revolution, and the American revolutionaries were called terrorists. They took civilian hostages. They were fighting for their freedom against an asymmetric power, a foreign aggressor. They were fighting for freedom of movement so they could develop further west. And they were fighting for what they saw as their basic freedoms. And if you look at the struggle in Gaza today, it's really the exact same, except it's much worse. The asymmetric power is far more gruesome. So I don't see how any American could oppose the resistance of the Palestinians and those in the axes of resistance.
Well, I mean, it's called the First Amendment for a reason, isn't it? Because without that First Amendment, no other freedoms can exist. If you don't have freedom of speech, how can you possibly have a democracy? And that was the shtick of the America First movement when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were imposed, and their big tech bro allies were throttling the life of people like you and me and hundreds of thousands of others, anyone with a different point of view, whether on mass medication or on foreign wars. If you stop people from freely speaking, how do you know that you've missed, therefore, the answer that you needed, the answer that we needed to hear? That's what John Stuart Mill said about liberty. It's not that those who are being denied freedom of speech are going to always be right. They may overwhelmingly always be wrong, but one time they may be right, and we will not have heard that which was right, because it was suppressed. I mean, I'm looking at Cornell University, I'm looking at Tufts, I'm looking all over the Columbia. Columbia is like a reign of terror, actually, at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the crazy thing is these students didn't even commit their so-called crimes when Trump was in office. They committed their alleged crimes and violations of the norms of the Trump administration during the Biden administration. So it's like the whole thing is insane. I don't understand how you can be prosecuting people for something that you didn't even have any oversight on. He wasn't in office. It wasn't his policy that they were protesting. They were protesting Joe Biden. And by now going after these protesters, Donald Trump is defending Joe Biden. He's defending Joe Biden's legacy. Donald Trump said that Joe Biden shouldn't bomb Yemen. Now Trump is bombing Yemen, again, defending Joe Biden's legacy and continuing it. And same thing with Iran. Now you have Donald Trump, who just a few weeks before the election said, you know, I don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, but we can't be bombing them. We can't bomb them. This is a horrible idea. Now, B-2 bombers at Diego Garcia with the in-air refueling planes, and they're having all these threats now about going in and bombing Iran. It's the most insane and hypocritical thing I've ever seen.
Do you think he's going to do that, Jackson, or is this the traditional art of the deal bluster?
I sure hope it's the art of the deal. I do think it is the art of the deal. I don't think he's and I really don't think he's that stupid. And the main reason why I say that, and I think it's the little known secrets that everyone secretly does know and they just don't want to say, is that if the U.S. gets into a war with Iran, violates Iranian sovereignty in a very big way on Iranian soil, then you will have trillions and trillions of dollars lost in the, not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy. Of course, the U.S. will be hit the hardest because they'll be the target with all of their infrastructure, ports, U.S. military assets, so on and so forth in the region that are right on Iran's doorstep. So I think if Trump is looking at this strictly as a businessman, he would be very, 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 very stupid even then to start a war with Iran.
Well, he doesn't even have John Bolton to blame anymore. I mean, it became a trope. Good czar, bad advisors. And if only Trump hadn't had John Bolton, he wouldn't have made some of the mistakes he made in his first term. But, I mean, who is it that's encouraging him to do such an insane thing if indeed he's going to do it?
Well, I don't think it's Elon Musk, because Elon Musk has posted memes about how we have all these U.S. military bases surrounding Iran, and Iran's not the one that's provoking the U.S. It's the other way around. I would imagine that it's the likes of Marco Rubio, although he doesn't really have a whole lot of power right now. He's complaining about how he has no power. He's being sent off to the Caribbean, to Jamaica, and even then he's...
Revolutionary salute to our Queen Alexis Bank for donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love, Queen. Salute, email, send. Oh, I got it, Queen. Okay. I definitely will get back in touch with you today. Appreciate your donation.
He's being, shown up by Cuban doctors who are saying, no, we're not going to leave Jamaica when you tell us to, Marco Rubio. I think it's mostly really just the Israel lobby. I don't think there's much of an ideological, overarching ideological strategy here. I do honestly believe that you have Miriam Adelson gave Trump $100 million. Sheldon Adelson gave Trump $100 million before he passed. You have the whole rest of the Israel lobby that's very powerful. Trump clearly has a good working relationship with Netanyahu as of right now. And I think this is the thing that Israel wants more than anything else, is to either go to war with Iran or to bring about the end of the Islamic Republic of Iran in a slow fashion, bit by bit, by forcing them into some horrible, renegotiated Iran deal, which will strip them of all their power.
I can't let you go without testing your views on Greenland and Canada. I don't know if you heard my monologue, but it's enough to make a horse laugh for me. The most supine satraps of the American empire, Denmark and Canada, are currently threatened by annexation from their overlord. As Oscar Wilde said on the death scene in Little Nell by Charles Dickens, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh.
Well, I don't really have any problem with them taking Greenland, because it's already basically ours. And some people are saying, "Oh, what about the threat against Russia and the you know, in the north?" And it's like, well, you know, that's already ours. Basically, we could do whatever we want there, and Russia has plenty of territory in the north at their disposal. But as for Canada, I 100% support taking Canada. I don't really know what his vision is here, but I think it would be a beautiful vision if the U.S. fully liberated Canada. We could drive cyber trucks up there and liberate it in cyber truck convoys or something. And the main reason for this is Canada has gone to war against the U.S. several times. There's been rumors that a lot of the some of the assassinations of U.S. presidents came in, British banking cartel plots out of Canada. And also, I love the idea of creating a land bridge with Russia through Canada. And this gets us one step closer.
Waging largely against China, and he has imposed very high tariffs on many countries all around the world. Trump announced the sweeping new tariffs in a ceremony outside the White House on the 2nd of April, and Trump claimed that this was Liberation Day.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again.
Now, Trump loves tariffs. This isn't new. During his first term, Trump also imposed tariffs on China. He started a trade war against China in 2018. And during his presidential campaign in 2024, Trump repeatedly said that he loves tariffs so much that he thinks that the word tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, more beautiful than love.
The word tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary, more beautiful than love, more beautiful than respect. No, less beautiful than religion, though, right? I don't want to get into that argument. But the word tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Remember that. It's going to make our country rich.
However, the tariffs that Trump is now imposing in his second term as U.S. president are much bigger than those he imposed in his first term and are going to have a huge impact not only on the U.S. economy, but on the global economy. Now, Trump claimed that these tariffs that he's imposing are so-called reciprocal tariffs, and the White House published a long list of countries showing what the new so-called reciprocal rate will be. At the ceremony, Trump even pulled out this comically large chart, and he named off countries like, for instance, China, which is going to face an additional 34% tariff plus the previous 20% tariff that Trump imposed, which means that the U.S. is now going to put a 54% tariff on all Chinese goods imported into the U.S. And the U.S. imports more goods from China than any other country. Trump also announced massive tariffs on other major trading partners of the U.S., like a 46% tariff on Vietnam. And the U.S. imports a lot of electronics, including cell phones and computers, from Vietnam, which means that the cost of those goods is going to massively increase. He likewise announced a 20% tariff on the European Union, a 24% tariff on Japan, a 25% tariff on South Korea, and high rates on many other major trading partners of the United States. Now, this is a crazy policy in numerous ways that I'll be discussing today. First of all, this is going to lead to high levels of inflation in the U.S. This is going to cause the price of goods to increase, which is deeply ironic because the reason that Donald Trump even won the 2024 presidential election in the first place is because there were high rates of inflation following the COVID pandemic. Incumbent parties and governments around the world lost power in elections. The Democrats were an example. Voters blamed Biden and Harris for the inflation, and Trump said he was going to bring down prices. But that's actually not even the craziest part of these tariffs that Trump is imposing. What's even crazier is that Trump has claimed that these are reciprocal tariffs, but the numbers that the White House is using are not the actual tariff rates charged by other countries. In other terms, it's a lie when Trump claims that these are reciprocal tariffs. This was pointed out on Twitter by the financial journalist James Surowiecki. He noted that in order to come to these numbers of the so-called reciprocal tariff rate, what the Trump White House actually did is they took the trade deficit that the U.S. has with each country and they divided it by the country's exports to the U.S. And then Trump said, well, I'm going to be kind, and instead of charging the exact rate, we'll charge half of that rate. So they multiplied that by 0.5. And what's so funny about this is that when this financial journalist pointed this out, the White House Deputy Press Secretary, Kush Desai, who works for Donald Trump, he tweeted, "No, we literally calculated tariff and non-tariff barriers." And he linked to the official statement on the website of the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, in which they explained how they calculated the so-called reciprocal tariffs. This paper said it would be very difficult to calculate the actual rate of tariffs and trade barriers that other countries have. So instead, as a proxy, they used the U.S. trade deficit with each country and determined what tariff level would be required to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with that country to zero. And in the formula that they wrote, they used Greek letters, which makes it look complicated, but it's actually not complicated at all. It's exports minus imports divided by, and then they use these Greek letters like epsilon, but it's by 0.5 times imports. So in other words, this journalist was right. The White House Deputy Press Secretary was wrong. This is not the actual tariff rate that countries are charging on the U.S. This is a formula the White House created based on the trade deficit that the U.S. has with each country. If you map out the tariff rate according to this formula, you can see that the tariff rate imposed on every single country maps 100% to trend. This is not based on the tariffs those countries are actually charging. This is totally arbitrary based on the U.S. trade deficit with that country. So in other words, what this journalist pointed out on Twitter was correct. The Deputy White House Press Secretary was wrong. The Trump White House doesn't even understand the formula that they published to determine their so-called reciprocal tariff rate, because it's not a reciprocal tariff rate. And using tariffs like this makes no sense, because Trump says, okay, we're going to put these tariffs on to bring our trade deficit with each country to zero. But if the U.S. wants to reduce its trade deficit with other countries, by definition, it has to export more to other countries. But other countries are also going to be imposing tariffs on the U.S., which means that other countries are not going to import goods from the U.S. because those U.S. goods will be even more expensive. The European Union has said very clearly that it's going to respond to Trump's tariffs with actual reciprocal tariffs. China has also said that it's going to respond to Trump's tariffs, which are now at 54%, because it's 34% plus the original 20%. China has said that it's going to respond also with actual reciprocal tariffs. And what's even funnier is that in this paper that the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative published to justify these so-called reciprocal tariffs that are not reciprocal, they cited an academic paper that talked about why international trade was good for U.S. consumers, because it brought down the price of consumer goods substantially. That's the paper they quoted in their article arguing why the U.S. should impose tariffs on all these countries. I mean, it truly is amazing. The Trump administration doesn't understand what the impact will be of these tariffs. not only on the United States, but on countries all around the world. This is very likely going to lead to a recession, or at the very least, a significant economic slowdown and a lot of problems, including increasing inflation. And I want to add another very important point here, which is the role of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Because if Donald Trump's goal with these tariffs is to reduce the trade deficit that the US has with the rest of the world, the US current account deficit, well, one of the best ways to do that would be to end the role of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. But Trump is doing the exact opposite of that. He is desperate to try to save the dominance of the US dollar, and he has threatened 100% tariffs on BRICS members and other countries around the world that try to de-dollarize and try to drop the use of the dollar in their international trade.
And we will keep the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, and it is currently under major siege. Many countries are leaving the dollar. They're not going to leave the dollar with me. I'll say, you leave the dollar. You're not doing business with the United States because we're going to put 100% tariff on your goods. BRICS was put there for a bad purpose. And most of those people they don't even want to talk about it now. They're afraid to talk about it because I told them if they want to play games with the dollar, then they're going to be hit with a 100% tariff the day they mention that they want to do it. And they will come back and say, we beg you not to do this. BRICS is dead since I mentioned that. BRICS died the minute I mentioned that.
Now, if Trump truly wants to reduce the U.S. trade deficit, this makes no sense whatsoever, because one of the main reasons for this massive U.S. trade deficit is because of the role that the U.S. plays in the global economy as essentially the banker of the world, as the printer of the global reserve currency. Because the inverse, by definition, by accounting, the inverse of the U.S. current account deficit, the trade deficit that the U.S. has with the rest of the world, is the U.S. capital account surplus. So what does that mean? It means that because the dollar is the global reserve currency, other countries around the world need to get access to dollars. How do they get those dollars? The U.S. has to run a trade deficit with other countries. Otherwise, they don't have the dollars they need for the dollar to be the global reserve currency. And then what happens is that people outside of the U.S. who get those dollars because they export products to the U.S. prints debt, and then it buys those products with the debt. Those dollars go to the foreign exporter. The exporter puts those dollars in its bank account, and then those dollars are used by investors in foreign countries to invest in U.S. assets. They buy U.S. stocks. They buy U.S. bonds, treasury securities. They buy U.S. real estate, and that causes the capital account to go into surplus. So there's all of this foreign finance capital that's constantly flowing into the United States, which is the inverse of its current account deficit. They're directly related. If you want to end the current account deficit, you also have to end the capital account surplus and vice versa. But Donald Trump doesn't understand any of this, which is why his policy makes no sense. Trump says he wants to reduce the U.S. current account deficit to zero, but then other countries won't have the dollars they need to keep using the dollar in international trade. But Trump says if they stop using the dollar in international trade, he's going to put tariffs on them. But then Trump also says if the other countries don't reduce their trade surplus with the U.S. to zero, he's also going to put tariffs on them. So what does he want? It makes no sense. The real way to reduce the U.S. trade deficit is to end the dollar system, is to move to a different kind of system like was originally proposed by John Maynard Keynes in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, his system of a bond corps, which would be an international unit of account. And then its value would be based on a basket of different commodities or maybe different currencies. That would be an actual solution. But instead of that, Trump is threatening any country that de-dollarizes. He's threatening BRICS. His strategy makes no sense. It's totally contradictory. And back in January, when Trump first announced 25% tariffs on the two largest trading partners of the U.S., Mexico and Canada, the Wall Street Journal editorial board referred to this as, quote, the dumbest trade war in history, end quote. And this latest escalation of the US trade war on the entire planet is even dumber. It makes no sense and is going to cause significant damage to the US economy. And Trump and his supporters claim, well, the reason that they're doing this is because they want to reindustrialize the US. Now, I am on record for years now saying that the US does need to reindustrialize, that deindustrialization has been a big problem in the US. But just imposing tariffs on the rest of the world is not going to magically reindustrialize the economy. Later, I'll talk more in detail about that. But this strategy is simply not going to work. Every single advanced economy that has industrialized in history has done so through a state-led developmental campaign using government investment in infrastructure, in education, in key manufacturing sectors, developing the human capital needed, investing in the actual capital equipment needed. And Trump is not doing any of that. He's imposing austerity and Reaganomics at the same time while he's putting on these tariffs and expecting that magically the free market will reindustrialize the US after it was exactly this kind of free market neoliberal economics that led the US economy to be deindustrialized in the first place. It's because the financial sector was deregulated under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and then also Bill Clinton in the 1990s. This was bipartisan in the neoliberal era, and it was much more profitable for capitalists in the US to invest in the financial sector, not in manufacturing. Instead, they sent their factories abroad where they could exploit low-paid labor. They also wanted to break the back of unions in the US. And what happened? Instead of investing in manufacturing and in production, US corporations, they stopped investing and they spent much of their net income to buy back their own stock and to pay out dividends to push up their share prices, because in the same time, thanks to the Jack Welch model of CEOs and restructuring of corporations, we saw that the incentives of all of these corporate executives was to boost the price of their stocks. And still today, CEOs are paid huge bonuses if they increase the price of their stocks. So their incentive is not to actually increase production and to invest. And this is why in 2014, Bloomberg reported that 95% of the earnings of the top 500 publicly traded companies in the US in the S&P 500 stock market index, 95% of their earnings went to buying back their own shares and to paying out dividends to shareholders. This is why companies don't invest in actual production. It's not nearly as profitable. So until the US government fundamentally changes its policies toward the financial sector, it's not going to be profitable for companies to invest in manufacturing and local production. They're going to continue to invest in the most speculative areas of the economy, which are the financial sector, real estate. Private equity is a good example of this. The reason that private equity exists as an industry is precisely because companies don't want to create a new company. They don't want to create new factories. They want to buy up existing companies and then sell those companies for parts, asset strip them. That's the entire business model of private equity. In fact, instead of trying to solve those problems by massively taxing the rich, by taxing capital gains, instead of that, what is the Trump administration doing? The exact opposite. The Trump administration is cutting taxes on the rich. It's cutting taxes on corporations, and it's implementing austerity and slashing government spending on education and infrastructure and all of the other elements of an actual industrial policy that would be needed to reindustrialize the US. So this policy makes no sense. And then there's the fact that it's going to lead to higher rates of inflation. Even before Trump announced these massive new tariffs, consumer price inflation was already increasing in the United States, and now it's likely to increase much more. The University of Michigan does a survey every month that looks at inflation expectations in the US, and they have found that US businesses are expecting much higher rates of inflation, And what happens when US businesses expect inflations? They start hiking prices, which causes inflation. The University of Michigan survey has also shown a major increase in inflation expectations among US consumers. And what happens when consumers expect a lot of inflation in the future? They go out and buy the products now because they say, well, today the products will be cheaper than they will be in a few months. So I might as well just get the products now before the prices go up. So what happens? A bunch of consumers go out, buy products, demand looks like it's higher. And what happens? Businesses start raising prices. This is exactly what is happening as consumers expect more and more tariffs. And they're saying, wow, the price of cell phones and computers and TVs, the prices are going to go up a lot. So I'm going to go buy this now. They go and buy them. Businesses raise the prices and you get more inflation, which is exactly what is already happening before Trump even announced these massive tariffs on countries all around the world. And it's not just in consumer goods like cell phones and TVs and computers. It's also food. And this has been a huge problem, is food inflation in the US, with things like eggs, the prices of eggs going through the roof. Well, now food companies are saying that because of tariffs, they're going to significantly raise food prices, not only of imported food because of the tariffs, but the food that they produce domestically is also going to go up. And Trump's tariffs make no sense because they're blanket tariffs. They're not targeted at specific industries. Like, it would make sense if he said that he wants to help rebuild the US car industry. So he's focusing specifically on tariffs on foreign cars. He did announce that, but now he's announcing blanket tariffs on everything, including food. So look at example like coffee. The US National Coffee Association points out that coffee cannot be grown in the US, only in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, which is a US colony. 99% of the coffee in the US is imported from other countries. The US imports its coffee from Brazil and Colombia and Vietnam and Honduras and other countries. And more than 70% of American adults drink coffee at least once per week. So Trump has now just increased the price of coffee for 70% of Americans. Or look at even more important foods like fruits and vegetables. The United States imports around 60% of all the fresh fruit sold in the country, and it imports about 40% of the fresh vegetables in the country. Trump has just massively increased the price of fruits and vegetables in the US. Because, okay, defenders of Trump would say, well, why don't we just produce more fruits and vegetables in the US? There are a lot of fruits and vegetables that cannot be produced in the US or only in certain states, like maybe Florida. How are you going to produce mangoes or bananas in Wisconsin? You're never going to be able to do it. Maybe in Florida and California, but the US imports a lot of these fruits and vegetables from other countries because the US can't produce them. And blanket tariffs will simply result in all of those foreign goods becoming much more expensive. I think people do not understand how much damage this is going to do to the US economy. Trump supporters really do not understand how reliant the US economy is on imports. If you look at the most recent data from the World Bank and the UN, which is from 2022, it shows that 17% of US imports come from China, 13.6% come from Mexico, 13.2% come from Canada, 4.6% come from Japan, 4.5% come from Germany, and 4% come from Vietnam. Trump has just imposed 53% tariffs on China, which is the largest exporter to the US, and he imposed 46% tariffs on Vietnam, which is the sixth largest exporter to the US. In 2024 alone, the United States imported $439 billion of goods just from China. So what exactly does the US import from China? Well, the number one item is cell phones and other phones, which are included under broadcasting equipment and also cameras. The second biggest is computers. The US also imports office machine parts, electrical transformers, electrical machinery, valves, electric batteries, electric heaters, toys, video games, seats, furniture. sweaters, clothes, many different kinds of textiles, plastic products, and things like Tupperware, motor vehicle parts for cars, and many, many, many other products. Trump thinks he can just magically open factories to produce all of these products domestically. But you know how difficult it is? You know how many decades it will take to build these factories, to train workers, to build all of these products that the US imports from China? You can't just magically import tariffs and then expect that you'll have a solution within one presidential term. This is going to take decades to do. The situation is the same with Vietnam. In 2024, the US imported $137 billion of goods from Vietnam, which has become a major producer of electronics. So what does the US import from Vietnam? Well, a lot of cell phones, a lot of computers, cameras, semiconductor devices, office machine parts, integrated circuits, insulated wire, electrical transformers, video displays, a lot of clothing and footwear, shoes, a lot of furniture, also rubber products and trunks and cases, iron products and other metal products. Again, the US is not going to be able to magically replace all of these goods and produce them locally. With what factories? With what workers? They have to train workers. They have to educate engineers. They have to physically build the factories. And who's going to build the factories? Who's going to invest? Where is the money going to come from? Is the US government going to actually invest in infrastructure that's needed to build all of these products, to make them domestically? The Trump administration does not have any other industrial policy. Its only magical solution is tariffs, and the free market will solve everything. That's not how industrial policy has worked in any country in history. These are the countries that the United States imports phones from. 28% of phones imports come from China. 7.5% come from Vietnam. 7% come from Malaysia. And the Trump administration just hit Malaysia with 24% tariffs. 5.25% of US imports of phones come from Thailand. And Trump just hit Thailand with 36% tariffs. Or let's look at computers. The United States gets 40.7% of its computer imports from China, and Trump just put 54% tariffs on China. The US also imports 15% of computers from Taiwan, which is known as Chinese Taipei in UN and in World Bank data, because according to international law, Taiwan is part of China, and in the data from these international law-based institutions, they refer to Taiwan as Chinese Taipei. So 15% of US phones imports come from Taiwan. And Trump also just put a 32% tariff on Taiwan. The US also gets 9.4% of its phone imports from Vietnam, and there is now a tariff rate of 46% on Vietnam. Let's look at electric batteries, which are needed for everything in the 21st century. Our phones, our computers, everything have batteries. 51.8% of batteries imported into the US come from China. 51.8%, over half. Another 16.6% come from South Korea. And Trump just put 25% tariffs on South Korea. Another 6.5% of US battery imports come from Japan. And Trump hit Japan with a 24% tariff rate. And an additional 5.4% of US imports of batteries come from Mexico. And Trump is putting 25% tariffs on Mexico. So what are Donald Trump's plans to actually produce cell phones, computers, and batteries in the US? Is the US government going to invest significantly in infrastructure? Is it going to invest in training workers to actually make these products domestically? No. The Trump administration does not have any actual industrial policy other than tariffs, and the free market will magically solve everything. Now, I was very critical of the Joe Biden administration, and there are infinitely many things you could criticize Biden and the Democrats for, especially the crimes against humanity that they committed in Gaza. Biden should be tried for crimes against humanity and war crimes. If the ICC were, the International Criminal Court, were a true non-biased institution, Biden and other US presidents, along with Trump, would be facing charges there at The Hague. But regardless, despite all of the infinitely many valid criticisms of the Biden administration, one of the things that Biden at least tried to do was to have a real industrial policy. The Biden administration passed two major pieces of legislation known as the funnily named Inflation Reduction Act, which is not really about inflation, the so-called IRA, which is also hilariously named. But anyway, the IRA was aimed at re-industrializing the US, but focusing on certain strategic sectors, especially in renewable energy, things like electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels and wind turbines. And also the Biden administration passed the CHIPS Act, which was a US government program to develop a local chips industry for semiconductors. And because of these US government incentives, including subsidies and tax breaks and infrastructure investment, there was genuinely a big increase in manufacturing production in the US in some of these areas. So despite the many valid criticisms of Biden, this was at least a legitimate attempt at trying to have an industrial policy. Trump, what is he doing? He's getting rid of all these policies. He's going against the actual industrial policy, tearing it all up, imposing austerity. And Trump thinks that simply by imposing tariffs, other companies will come invest in the US and open factories. Well, they're not going to do that for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's very risky and it's not very profitable. And that's why, again, a lot of companies would simply prefer to put their money into financial speculation, not intangible production. But furthermore, when the Biden administration tried to offer incentives and big tax breaks and subsidies worth billions of dollars to companies to manufacture chips, semiconductors locally, you know what happened? TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, they opened up factories in Arizona, but they found that there were no workers. They didn't have the skilled workers in the US who knew how to actually manufacture these chips. In addition to the billions of dollars and the years that it will take to build these factories and to create the infrastructure, it will also take years to train the workers they need to work in these very advanced factories that include a lot of automation and robots. It's very complicated. You can't just bring someone and immediately teach them how to make semiconductors. So what was the solution to this problem? TSMC sent their workers from Taiwan to Arizona. 50% of the employees in these factories in Arizona are from Taiwan. But then Trump says he wants to crack down on immigration and he wants these jobs to go to Americans. But you can't just magically reindustrialize. The US has been deindustrializing over decades since the financialization of the economy and the rise of neoliberalism. You have lost generations of workers who had the skills needed to work in these factories. So if the US government wants to reindustrialize, the US government needs to invest a lot of money in education and in training workers. But instead of doing that, Donald Trump is doing the exact opposite. Donald Trump in March signed an executive order to dismantle the US Department of Education at a time when large numbers of Americans have trouble reading at an adult level. They read it at the level of children. A lot of Americans understand mathematics and science at the level of an elementary school student, and Trump is busy dismantling the education department. You know, one of the main reasons why China has become the world's manufacturing superpower, it's because the Chinese government has prioritized industrial upgrading and has made plans. The Communist Party of China every 5 years publishes a new 5-year plan. And if you read the 5-year plan, at the heart of it is industrial upgrading. In 2015, China announced the Made in China 2025 initiative, and they said, we're going to target these sectors. We're going to massively invest in these sectors, provide government support in order to develop a semiconductor industry, electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, and China has succeeded. And in a conservative estimate, China spends 1.73% of GDP on industrial policy, in subsidies and cheap loans from state-owned banks, in infrastructure investment, in worker training, in order to develop these advanced industries. And here we see the Trump administration saying it wants to reindustrialize, but imposing austerity. I know I keep repeating myself, but this literally makes no sense. It's the exact opposite of an industrial policy. So what this all leads me to wonder is if the Trump administration, not just Trump himself, but his advisors, the people around him, not everyone in the Trump administration is stupid, although there clearly are a lot of very dumb people. But what I keep asking myself is, do they really think that they can actually reindustrialize the US with this strategy? Or are they trying to do something different? And maybe this is not actually about reindustrializing the US. What this is really about is shifting the tax burden permanently off of capital, off of the rich, off of corporations, and onto workers, onto poor Americans. And the more I think about it, the more I see what they're doing, I think this is the real goal of what the Trump administration is doing. They say they're going to reindustrialize, but in reality, Trump has said several times, he said it publicly, that he wants to replace the income tax and certainly capital gains tax with tariffs, which is a very regressive tax. Now, the US tax system is already very regressive in practice. On paper, it's supposedly progressive, but thanks to Trump's tax cuts on the rich during his first administration, as of 2018, billionaire families in the US pay a lower tax rate than the bottom half of Americans, of poor and working class Americans. So this is already, in practice, a very regressive tax system. But economists have shown that according to Trump's proposal for his second term, which he's in now, what he's going to be doing is massively increasing taxes on poor and working class Americans in the form of tariffs. And Trump claims that by imposing tariffs on countries around the world, that will help make up for the revenue, the government revenue that's lost by the tax cuts on the rich. Because Trump has pledged to continue cutting taxes on the rich and to cut taxes on corporations, and this is going to benefit only around 5% of the population, a small handful of elites who are going to see their taxes reduced by $36,000 in terms of the richest 1%. But then the bottom 95% of Americans, the vast majority, will have their taxes increased in the form of tariffs. And honestly, I think this is the real goal of Trump's tariffs. It's not actually reindustrialization. It's moving the burden of taxation onto poor and working people. And the rich can continue to do whatever they want and buy up companies. Private equity will boom. The stock market will probably go back to booming after this temporary crash that we're seeing and this crisis in the stock market because of the tariffs. In a year or two, we'll see what happens. But I think this is the Trump administration's real goal. And they say that they're going to help people through reindustrialization and they're going to bring back jobs to the Rust Belt. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they are stupid and they think this is going to work. But actually, I think this just could be all a cynical maneuver. And they know it's not going to reindustrialize the U.S. But they also know that they can cut taxes on the rich and make up for some of that loss by increasing taxes effectively on the vast majority of poor and working people in the U.S. That's frankly the conclusion that I'm increasingly coming to here. Maybe I'm wrong. We'll see what happens. It's very hard to predict what Trump will do because by nature, he pursues this kind of madman theory where he tries to scare everyone and says one thing and does another. So we'll see what happens. I mean, it's very possible that he could suddenly do a 180 and then say that he's going to lift all of these tariffs that he's announced on countries around the world. It's impossible to predict what Trump will do. But based on the evidence, it seems to me that this is all part of a strategy of moving the tax burden off of the rich and putting it on the poor and the working class. And tariffs are just an excuse for doing that. On that note, I'm going to conclude.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. We're going to make it wealthy, good and wealthy. For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. American steelworkers, auto workers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen. We have a lot of them here with us today. They really suffered gravely. They watched in anguish as foreign leaders have stolen our jobs, foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories, and foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful American dream.
The impact of Trump's tariffs are expected to be felt around the world. While Trump claims the tariffs will boost the U.S. economy, many economists fear it could lead to a recession or worse. Trump's trade war could also shift global alliances as countries seek new trading partners. China, Japan, South Korea have already announced plans to increase trading ties and coordinate their response to Trump's tariffs. We begin today's show with Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus, University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School. He's the founder of Democracy at Work and hosts a weekly national TV radio program called Economic Update, the author of a number of books, including most recently Understanding Capitalism and the Sickness is the System, when capitalism fails to save us from pandemics or itself. Professor Wolff, it's great to have you with us again. Well, start off by responding to, and were you surprised, shocked, or do you guess that, well, about 185 countries were going to see increased or tariffs?
On the one hand, we knew something like this was coming. On the other hand, the sweep and the scope of it does make you stop. Mr. Trump is right. It is a changing moment in American history and world history. But I think his representation of what's going on is completely fantastical and has only to do with the self-promotion that he is engaged in most of the time. It was never foreigners who did it to us. This notion of the United States as a victim, we have been one of the greatest beneficiaries in the last 50 years of economic wealth, particularly for people at the top, just like him. It has nothing to do with foreigners taking advantage of us. This attempt to make himself strong and powerful relative to others, to blame the foreigner. These are cheap shots that a real president wouldn't do. And there's the most important point. The American economy is in trouble. The American empire is in decline. We don't want to discuss it in this country. We engage in denial, and instead we are striking out at other people, a sad way of handling a decline. The British Empire declined before us, so did all the others. We are now at that point. We had a great 20th century. 21st century is different. You have to face those problems. That's not being done. What's being done is to say we have difficulties, but they're all somebody else's fault, and we're going to solve it by punishing them. I would like to point out, as you suggest quite rightly, Amy, that the rest of the world is not going to sit by. The United States does not have the power it had in the 20th century. It is not in the position it seems to imagine itself. When the Secretary of the Treasury added to Mr. Trump's comments that he warned the rest of the world not to retaliate, that would imply that if they do, there would be escalation. Yes, he said, there will be escalation. Well, nothing will guarantee more escalation than if they do nothing, because then it's an invitation to Mr. Trump to keep doing it as each of these efforts doesn't work.
Given how dramatic this was yesterday, is it possible he was deciding this to the very last second as they put this off? And explain exactly. You're a professor, you're a teacher. Most people don't even realize how tariffs work.
Okay. A tariff is a tax. It's just a particular tax that got that name. It used to be called import duty. All it means is when something comes into the United States that was produced outside, and is brought in to be sold, it has to pay a tax, as literally as it crosses our border into our country. It is paid by the American company that brings it in, which may pass it on to the consumer, usually what happens, and the tax goes to Uncle Sam. It goes to Washington. Mr. Trump loved to suggest that tariffs were paid by the others, a little bit like Mexico would pay for the wall. Never happened. It's not going to happen here either. It's an American tax. And there's something remarkable that clues you into how big a change this is, that the Republican Party, which has branded itself as the anti-tax party for a century, is now imposing the most massive tax imaginable. Why this big change? Because we have big, big problems, and this kind of slapping the rest of the world is an attempt to solve a little bit of them, but it is not going to work because we don't have the power to do it anymore.
I want to go to UAW President Sean Fain, who supports Trump's new tariffs, saying last week, "We applaud the Trump administration for stepping up to end the free trade disaster that's devastated working class communities for decades." Fain spoke Sunday on CBS's Face the Nation.
We've seen over 90,000 manufacturing facilities leave the United States. We've seen in the big three alone in the last 20 plus years, 65 plants have closed. And so, look, tariffs aren't the total solution. Tariffs are a tool in the toolbox to get these companies to do the right thing, and the intent behind it is to bring jobs back here and invest in the American workers. If they're going to bring jobs back here, they need to be life-sustaining jobs where people can make a good wage, a living wage, have adequate health care, and have a retirement security, and not have to work 7 days a week or multiple jobs just to scrape to get by paycheck to paycheck.
Well, while UAW President Sean Fain praised Trump's tariffs, he also said he had great concerns about President Trump's move to eliminate contracts for 700,000 federal workers, the firing of workers at the National Institute of Health and other agencies.
I was a bit disappointed. I like Sean Fain, many of us do. But this was disappointing. To say, basically, I will support the president because he does something that might help my union, even though Sean Fain knows, as most economists do, that if you put a tax on the goods coming in, they will go up in price because we have to pay that tax now. And that will lead to domestic producers able to raise their prices because their competitors from abroad are stuck with this tax. So we expect a boost to inflation, which is going to hurt the working class of this country in a very serious way, especially if it builds on itself, which often happens when you do tariffs like this. And I want to remind everyone, including Sean Fain, that the auto workers also represent workers in places that need export markets that produce in America and sell abroad. When those countries retaliate, as they likely will, we will lose export markets, and that will mean fewer jobs. And no one, let me stress, no one now knows whether the jobs lost from this trade war will be greater or smaller than any jobs that are gained. It is a big risk being taken by Mr. Trump, and if it doesn't go well, it'll be very bad for the American economy. It will produce the recession folks are worried about, because if the prices go up, people buy less, and that loses jobs. When you look at all of this, this is an incredibly risky effort to blame the world, punish the world, and then cross his fingers, which is what he's doing, hoping it comes out all right. Reminds me of the football metaphor. This is a Hail Mary pass. You throw it down the field. You hope it bounces into your team's hands. But that's all it is, a long shot. And it's a sign of how troubled the American economy now is.
If you can put this in the bigger picture, talk about the tax cuts and how they fit into the tariffs. What is it, something like $4 trillion in tax cuts and who benefits? And then talk about the other issues that President Trump keeps saying that they're not going to touch, even though what many call his co-president, Elon Musk, whether he steps back from being, giving speeches or not, going after Social Security, issues like Medicaid.
Let me start with the tax issue. The biggest single thing that Trump did in his first presidency was the tax cut of December 2017. And when that tax cut was written into law, it had a sunset. It expires this year, 2025. If that expiration is allowed to happen, corporations and the rich, who were the big beneficiaries back then, will face a big tax cut. He doesn't want to do that because that's his base, that's his donor support. He doesn't want to have those taxes go back up. Well, then what is he going to have to do? If he keeps on spending and he doesn't let those taxes go back up, he's going to have to borrow trillions, as we have been doing. He doesn't want to be the president who keeps borrowing trillions, in part because the rest of the world is a major creditor of the United States, and they're not going to continue to do it the way they have. So he's in a jam. He has to do something. So his hope is to savage the expenditures in this country. Look what he's doing. Mr. Musk stands there with a chainsaw to give us the clear implication. I'm going to solve the problem on the backs of the working class. I'm firing them all. I don't care what the rest of the working class suffers. I'm going to fire all these people without notice, without plan. Calling this efficient is a silly joke. An efficient process takes time, takes experts. You're not doing that. You're just wholesale firing. Calling that efficiency is an attempt to fool people that shouldn't make any difference. Mr. Trump is now in a jam. He can't get out of this without in some way solving the problem that has been built up. And there is no way other than the one he's doing, because it's the last gasp of how to take away from the mass of the people the ability to borrow. I mean, let's be honest. If you put a tariff, you make everything coming in from abroad more expensive. That means people will buy less of it. They'll shrink their standard of living. If American companies take advantage of the tariff, which they always do by raising their prices, that will also hurt the working class. You are immiserating your workers in order to try to solve the problem you haven't solved before. But here's the irony that may in the end come back to haunt us. Europe has been unable to unify under the umbrella of American alliances. The enmity of the United States is bringing Europe together better than the alliance was able to do. And as you pointed out, very important, China, Japan, and South Korea, with long histories of animosity and tension, are getting together to cope with this. Wow, we are unifying the whole world. If you want the big picture, in my judgment, after World War II, George Kennan taught us about containment. We're going to contain the Soviet Union. The irony, which the philosopher Hegel would enjoy, we are becoming contained. We are isolating ourselves. The votes in the UN are the United States alone, or the United States and Israel and 2 or 3 other countries. The isolation politically, the isolation now economically. We are the rogue nation for the rest of the world. We may not want it, we may not agree, but it doesn't really matter if that's how they perceive us. And that's what's happening.
You talked about South Korea, Japan, and China joining together. One of the biggest announcement of tax cuts was against Taiwan. It's just a little more complicated for Taiwan to join that group.
And also another one was Vietnam, which got a very heavy whack. I mean, is there no recognition of what the United States did to that country? Maybe you wouldn't want to crush them with this kind of a thing after. I mean, as I'm saying, this is a change. This is a sign to the world that as the United States empire declines, this is a nasty place that's going to, gesture and thrash around, doing damage everywhere as it copes with its own decline.
Former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis recently wrote a piece headlined Donald Trump's Economic Master Plan. He wrote, quote, "This is what his critics don't understand. They mistakenly think he thinks that his tariffs will reduce America's trade deficit on their own. He knows they won't. Their utility comes from their capacity to shock foreign central bankers into reducing domestic interest rates. Consequently, the euro, the yen, and the renminbi will soften relative to the dollar. This will cancel out the price hikes of goods imported into the U.S. and leave the prices American consumers pay unaffected. The tariff countries will be, in effect, paying for Trump's tariffs. Do you agree with that, Professor Wolf?
No, even though Giannis and I do a lot of work together, so normally I defer to him. He's wonderful in his analysis. I don't think this is correct. Is it a possible outcome? Yes. You know, we're in a situation. Let me put it this way. Tariffs are not new. They've been around for hundreds of years. If you teach a course in international economics, which I've done, you tell students, here are 1,000 books, here are 5,000 articles. We know. And the answer is, when you impose a tariff, you don't know what the outcome is because it depends on everything else going on. Interest rates, exchange rates of currencies, rising or falling economies around the world. You can't know in advance. It's a very risky thing, which is why for the last 50 years, we have had, administered by the U.S., something called free trade or neoliberal or globalization. All of that is over now. The United States can't win anymore in that system, so it is reverting to economic nationalism. And that's a fundamental shift that throws the world. It was the accepted wisdom for 50 years, the last 50 years, not to do what Mr. Trump is doing now. If you want, you can think that everybody who thought that way for 50 years was wrong, and Mr. Trump, the genius, is correct. But that would be a long shot. Better bet he's trying to save his own political life, and he's trying to cope, to his credit, with a declining economy without having to admit that that's the case. This won't end well. It normally doesn't. And what we're going to see is the fighting against one another of the Europe bloc, the Asian bloc, the American bloc, at a time when the United States is weaker than it has been economically and politically. Look at the debacle in the Ukraine as well, the misunderstanding that the Russians could turn to the Chinese and the Indians to cope with the costs of that war in a way that hadn't been calculated and is turning out to shape the outcome. And it's not a question of which side you're on, but just watching how it lines up. That's the problem.
30 seconds. As you often talk about, are you saying this is the beginning of the end of American empire?
Yes. I think we are already in 10, 12 years of that decline. It can't. Here's a single best statistic. If you add up the GDP, you know, the total output of goods and services in a year for a country, of the United States and its major allies, the G7, it's about 28% of global output. If you do the same thing for China and the BRICS, it's about 35%. They're already a bigger block of economic power than we are. Every country in the world thinking about building a railroad or expanding its health program. They used to send their people to Washington or London to get help. They still do. But when they're done, they send the same team to Beijing, New Delhi, Sao Paulo, and they often get a better deal. The world is changing. And the United States could cope, but as with alcoholism, you have to admit you have a problem before you're in a position to solve it. We have a nation that does not yet want to face what this all adds up to.
Trump got some browning points from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu on Monday. Netanyahu says Trump is doing exactly what he wants. And this is a template that other governments should use to do what Netanyahu wants. Trump is basically being a good dog, and other nations should do this too. What he's talking about is the war on anti-Semitism. What he is admitting is that Israel now has the power to define anti-Semitism and get people punished for what is not really anti-Semitism. It's criticizing the government of Israel. Now, when in the comments I see, oh, you're being anti-Semitic because we criticize handily, the government of Israel has nothing to do with Jewish people or Jewish practitioners. We're talking about criticizing Israel. Netanyahu very much would like you to get those two things confused and get arrested and get kicked out of a country if you're an immigrant, and get punished and get deplatformed if you criticize Israel, because they would like the definition of anti-Semitism to engulf that. So you can't criticize the government. When you can't criticize the government, guess where you're headed? Not to a good place. Watch this clip. And then after, watch Trump's accountant and Israeli ambassador David Friedman take this even a step further when he says the government should jail student protesters and critics of the government of Israel, like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens. They should put them to jail because we can't win them over ideologically. Watch.
These ignorant demonstrators. Who are they demonstrating for? For these murderers, these rapists, these mass killers. This is a reflection of a deep rot that has pervaded the intellectual hub of free societies. And this vilification of Israel, the Jewish people, and Western values has been propagated by a systemic alliance between the ultra-progressive left and radical Islam. It must be resolutely fought by civilized societies to safeguard their future. This is why we must all commend President Trump's decisive actions against anti-Semitism, and we must pressure other governments to do the same.
A government can do.
Just a second. He's saying we pressured the United States and got our way, so we got to pressure other governments too. That's unacceptable, right? How do you feel about that, knowing that the pressure of a foreign government has now put laws down on your own life? Now watch, again, this second part where this gentleman will say that we just got to jail these people. We can't win ideologically, so straight to jail.
And so when we talk about the importance of a bipartisan fight against anti-Semitism, which of course I endorse, and I, as my predecessor said, I condemn anti-Semitism on the right and on the left. I'm an equal opportunity condemner of anti-Semitism.
You're alluding to Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, none of them are any good on the right. On the left, I don't like any of these anti-Semites, and I'm not shy about it. But the government, the United States government, or the government of France, or the government of any other country, has the power to rein in anti-Semitism in a much more effective way. And you know, people say, well, you know, the governments are not in the business of changing the way people think. That's true, but you know, to my thinking, most people who are, you know, anti-Semites, most of these people running around, we're not going to win their hearts and minds because they don't have hearts and they don't have minds. So, you know, how are we going to, there's no reason to think we're ever going to convince them, but we can deport them, we can put them in jail, we can make their lives miserable, we can cut off their funding. And that's what the Trump administration is doing for the first time.
Wow, so they're applauding that. Yeah. That's crazy.
It's crazy. I mean, he just said the government doesn't do anything to influence people, but it's like they're making you think that anti-Semitism and being against what Israel is doing is the same thing. That's so frustrating.
Right.
We would be on that list.
It's incredibly frustrating. Right, because it's nonsense. We all know that you should be able to criticize a government without it extrapolating it to their people. We criticize America all the time. We're not self-hating Americans.
Well, just to chime in, it's also legal to be anti-Semitic.
Yes.
I mean, that is still free speech. I don't condone it, but what are they going to, like, anybody they deem racist now goes straight to jail? Is that where we're at? Yes. Or is it, you know, it's, yeah. But that's not what they're saying.
Literally what he just said. Yeah.
Right, but he's not saying any racism. He's saying just specifically anti-Semitism.
Right, but how long until this is extrapolated to any group that you want as a control mechanism? If you read 1984, it's put rats on your head if you don't agree. I will make you think this, right? Because I can't win the logic argument, so I will punish you. I will put you in jail until you parrot the government line. The Trump administration is taking this even further. Now they are reviewing nearly $9 billion in federal grants at Harvard while it investigates how the university handled anti-Semitism. Now, the administration said that they have proven that they will, quote, take swift action to hold institutions accountable if they allow anti-Semitism to fester, and they will not hesitate to ask if Harvard fails to do so. They will not hesitate to act. Now, what is it that Harvard is guilty of? There are no reports of actual violence, but there were confrontations between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel students, and they confronted each other and they doxed each other. So why is only one group being protected here and not the other? The other group was harmed too. Colombia was targeted by the Trump administration just days ago, and they capitulated to the government demands to review policies towards Jewish students, including allowing them to review the curriculum. So what's happening here? Why are our rights being eroded for one group only? In a congressional hearing on Monday, Rabbi Levi Shemtov told the Senate that it's not enough to be anti-Semitic. Watch.
Anti-Semitism is not just an age-old prejudice. It is a contemporary crisis manifesting on campuses across the nation. It is not enough for individuals or institutions to merely claim they are not anti-Semitic. As my father once taught me, it is not enough for people, especially public figures, to be neutral or not be anti-Semitic. One must be anti-Semitic. We must demand the same of our universities and government institutions. This hearing, in my opinion, is an attempt to be just that, anti-Semitic.
All right, where have you heard this before? Anti-Semitic. Where does this ring a bell? Over the last few years, it should, because this is a playbook out of the Obama and the Biden administrations. We heard nonstop from the Democrats, only it was about blacks mostly. And this was the birth of neo-racism, which is ranking people by race and color to bestow privileges on some and not others. So it's worthwhile to ask, why are only some groups worthy of extra protections and others are told to just stop being babies, they're not victims, move on? So if you sort of came around on this rhetoric by Republicans that neo-racism is racism and critical race theory is racism, wouldn't you feel kind of betrayed watching them do it to Jews and say, no, but Jews are actually the victims here, and so they get special protections? It rings hollow when you say, oh, no, it's not a thing, but it's a thing for them and them only. How do you reconcile that? And again, I go back to the way we covered the BLM riots and this and the neo-racism is that the law needs to be enforced equally. If Jewish students get hurt, their perpetrators should be punished. If there are, vandalized classrooms disrupted, prosecute that equally. There's no need to say we're going to prosecute only on certain racial groups and not others. Just a reminder that this hearing is still there to promote the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which did pass the House in 2023 and is still with the Senate. And it broadens the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticisms of Israel. It also would include, and this comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, saying this separate group defines anti-Semitism from now on. So that group can broaden the definition and we will prosecute you accordingly. It also says that you couldn't publicize any, quote, claims of Jews killing Jesus. So the Bible, therefore, becomes anti-Semitic. Does the Trump administration and Congress really want to forbid people from criticizing Israel as law? Are they going to go further and put people in jail, as was suggested? Is this literally Netanyahu pulling the puppet strings of Trump? How can you see it any other way? Why? So let me know what you think of that before we move on.
And unfortunately, you look at all of the people in the Senate and Congress that are on the dole for Israel, even the Speaker of the House. So it's like if that legislation is proposed, it'll probably pass.
Yeah. And I just think, I wonder, people like me who maybe were proponents of critical race theory and then studied it and realized, oh, this is not helping anybody, actually. This is probably hurting Black people more than anything else. We're making them professional victims. We're denying their own progress that they made on their own before the Civil Rights Act. We should not be the government should not be in the business of this. I want nothing to do with it. And then I feel really betrayed to have the party that broke this down build it back up for a different group. And I wonder if I were Black and had come around to that same conclusion, wouldn't I feel betrayed? What do you think of that, David? You don't have to.
I mean, I think it's
specifically, but
I don't agree with any of it.
I don't understand it. I just don't understand it, how you can break it down to build it back up. Okay.
Yeah.
Redacted is brought to you by Home Title Lock. Now, this is something, if you're a homeowner,
Well, I have to tell you. No, I want to tell you because I want to talk all about this because I don't know if you know the scammers can literally steal your home right out from under you. And it's unbelievable because I got some new data on this. The FBI calls it house stealing, and it's a growing real estate scam right now that's targeting American homeowners. And here's how it works. So criminals basically forge your signature on one document. Then they use a fake notary stamp. And you can get these things printed out like easily on Amazon, a fake notary stamp. And then they stamp it. They pay a small fee, and then you file it with your local recorder's office, and then boom, just like that, your home title is literally transferred out of your name, stolen, gone. And this happens in the middle of the night. And I've spoken to individuals that this has happened to, and it's terrifying. Then they can actually take out
but man, this all just points in such a bad direction, and it's disappointing. It's just really disappointing. It's I knew I would be disappointed, but it is on the level of a Greek tragedy that these guys had this mandate and this opportunity, and they're just fucking it all up.
So recently, Dave Smith had a podcast where he talks about his frustrations with the Trump administration, especially in recent weeks. And I have a feeling I'm going to agree to some of the frustrations he's expressing. So let's watch and let's react.
So the latest is that yesterday, Donald Trump, of course, because he's Donald Trump, he threatened to bomb Iran. This was, I think, in many ways, kind of the most serious sounding of his constant need to flirt with yet another disastrous war in the Middle East, and coincidentally, the only war that hasn't been checked off of the clean break foreign policy of the what has become the famous 7 wars in 5 years that 4-star General Wesley Clark, the supreme leader of the NATO allies, that he himself said that he saw the plans for, that we were going to have 7 wars in 5 years. It obviously didn't happen in the 5 years, although there's actually quite a bit of evidence that they thought they would get this war quite a while ago. But they, of those 7 countries, 6 of the wars have happened. This is the 7th. Iran happens to be the same. Now, of course, there is absolutely no political appetite for another catastrophic, disastrous war in the Middle East. Donald Trump won the presidency twice explicitly on distancing himself from that type of foreign policy, and yet Donald Trump continues to saber rattle toward this policy, which would be, again, as we both mentioned before, Rob, it would almost seem like, with Donald Trump just humiliating the Democrats and public opinion completely turning on the Democrats to the point that the brand of the party is toxic in a way like neither of the major 2 parties have ever been in my lifetime. And at that moment, you go, okay, there's probably only one thing that could totally ruin this and usher back in the Democratic establishment. And that would be another catastrophic war in the Middle East.
This is so true. I'm so with Dave on this one. It's either a war that could sink it or an economic collapse. And Trump has more control over that, a starting of a war, launching of a war, than an economic collapse from the presidency. And there is no constituency for this saber rattling with Iran other than the Israel lobby and a few neocons out there who Trump supposedly destroyed politically. But doesn't seem to be the case because some crept into the administration and still exert foreign policy influence on it, like Mike Waltz, who we've talked a lot about in the last week. So Dave's right on here. Iran would be catastrophic if the U.S. was to launch a war against them. Only the military-industrial complex and the Israel lobby truly want that.
And so, of course, that's what we've got to move closer and closer toward. It's really, it's astounding to say. Anyway, so Donald Trump, I have his quote here. He said, speaking to NBC News in a phone interview yesterday, Donald Trump said, if they don't make a deal, there will be bombing. It will be bombing the likes of which they have never seen before. Donald Trump is saying that they need now to make a nuclear deal, or Donald Trump will bomb Iran like they've never seen before. This comes after, and I'm quoting here from Dave DeCamp's article over at antiwar.com. Go follow antiwar.com. Go follow Dave DeCamp. They are the best. This is after the U.S. intelligence agencies, in their annual threat assessment, said that there is no evidence that Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon.
It's always the propaganda that they'll have the nuclear weapon in a year or two after they want to bomb Iran, and the drumbeat of war starts up against Iran.
It seems that the 2003 ban that the Ayatollah put on weapons of mass destruction is still in place. Of course, we've heard endless propaganda over the years about how Iran is on the verge of building a nuclear weapon, and Benjamin Netanyahu was decent enough to give us a timetable building that bomb. They should have it in 5 years from 1992, but also they should have it in 5 years from 2003, and then also they should have it in 5 years from 2015, and then also they should have it in 5 years from 2018.
Yeah.
My guess is they're still 5 years away, according to Benjamin Netanyahu, but we're really getting there. We're getting really close now to this war, to fighting a war against a third world country that does not have nuclear weapons, does not have an air force capable of reaching the United States of America. In other words, poses zero threat to our country, but is an enemy of Israel in the region, and therefore we, I guess, gotta flirt with this war.
The only way that they can sell this in the interests of U.S. security is to point to Iran's capacity to strike U.S. troops that happen to be all in the vicinity in the Middle East as part of the U.S. empire. So they're going to have to say, well, Iran can strike our troops, and they put their country way too close to our foreign military bases and troops that we sent there. It's so preposterous. Iran has no ability to affect America, to conquer it. They don't have an aircraft carrier, don't have a serious navy, don't have an air force. They don't even have a nuclear weapon yet. So this is just insane. Again, there's no security concern that would lead us to have to topple Iran. It's sheerly in the interest of the Israel lobby and AIPAC.
This is not just an isolated statement, and I'm really not doing the thing where people just flip out over Donald Trump saying something provocative. This is much more than that. I mean, he is already continuing Joe Biden's policy of backing unconditionally Israel, doing whatever they want to do to the Palestinian people, even when they're violating the ceasefire that the Trump administration pressured them to put in place. We still have to back them. He's now openly, of course, put out the idea of ethnically cleansing Gaza on behalf of the Israelis. He has started bombing the Houthis for standing up to the Israelis. And now even though on that signal thread, as was pointed out by his own people, this is completely in opposition to everything Donald Trump stood for. I mean, down to the detail of on Tim Pool's show, he said Joe Biden was an idiot for bombing Yemen for the exact same reason that he's bombing them. And they could say what they want on that signal chat about the way to sell this thing is to be like, Biden was weak and we have to be strong. But the reality is that Biden was bombing the same group of people for the same reason, and Trump said it was stupid. Trump said, why are they always trying to bomb everything?
To clarify, Dave's referencing Pete Hegseth, who said that the way to sell this to the American people, this bombing of the Houthis in Yemen, is number one, he had bullet points. Number one is to say that Biden was weak. And number two, tie them to Iran. So this is why. This is where they're selling it. It's on behalf of Israel. And Trump denounced Biden for doing this in 2024 on Tim Pool, as Dave said. And he's been a charlatan on the issue. You know, Trump had the ability to just let his support of Israel, with which all distance essentially knew was there, not creep into these external wars. And it's just gotten too crazy.
Up a phone, do some diplomacy. Anyway, he's back in there now, so that's changed. And, you know, it's just at a certain point, you do have to be honest about kind of the broader picture. I think there was a lot of excitement about Donald Trump's presidency. I think that this is the way I said it on the members only show the other day, right? And I think I pretty much still feel this way. But I basically said, imagine you could pick like 3 baskets, okay, for Donald Trump's second term. And in one basket, you would be like, these are the good things that we'll get out of it. And in one basket, you'd be like, these are the bad things that we'll get out of it. And then in another basket, there were like the question marks. Maybe this could go good. Maybe this could, you know, and we've gotten, I think we kind of knew, like, I think I talked about this, the episode that I said I was going to support him. We knew what a lot of the bad things were. We knew he's terrible on Israel. He really doesn't get it on foreign policy. He really, you know what I mean? Like, is just awful on that stuff. On the positive sides, you were like, he's much better on Ukraine. He's much better, like a real improvement from the Biden administration. And then, of course, in the positives was that he dealt a just enormous blow to the corporate media. The way I said it was, I think in 2016, he destroyed the Republican establishment. And in 2024, he destroyed the Democratic establishment. He was a reset in a lot of ways in American politics, or maybe not a reset, but like a massive, you know, like if it was a snow globe, you just grabbed it and shook it up. Everything's different now.
I think this is a very nuanced and appropriate view of Trump leading into that election for sure. And I didn't support him either. But I think in hindsight, he's actually a little bit worse on Ukraine than I think a lot of us thought he was at that time. Because, again, Zelensky waltzed into the White House and acted like he owned the entire U.S. Treasury. And Trump basically destroyed him in front of everyone, in front of the cameras and the media. And he was able to shut off aid to Ukraine. And he would have had the political capital to keep it there shut off. But he couldn't resist restoring it several days later. And now we're back to square one. And Trump's talking about sanctioning Russia and how, you know, Putin's a villain. And it doesn't seem like diplomacy's on the table really anymore, at least now. And that's horrific.
It also, just culturally, I think there was something very important about the Trump victory. But then there were these baskets of question marks. And, you know, as Donald Trump was actually putting Kash Patel to head the FBI, at least attempting to put Matt Gaetz at the Justice Department, was putting Tulsi in charge of the intelligence community, there was this question mark that started to get raised that was like, hey, maybe the guy learned something. And maybe because he's been so burned by this system, he's actually in a different mindset now. Maybe he's actually like going to be doing some really good things.
I think that was completely reasonable to think, you know, 2 weeks in, or even when he started announcing many of his cabinet picks. Some of them were garbage. We talked about it before. Rubio and Waltz and Ratcliffe were terrible. But when he started picking, you know, Bhattacharya and Patel, that one came later, and Tulsi and RFK, a lot of people thought like this, he actually is trying to disrupt DC to an extent he never did before in his first administration. So it wouldn't have been unreasonable, I think, to believe that at the time.
That are better than what we could have hoped for. I gotta say at this point, I think those question marks have been answered, and all in the negative. Just all bad. You know, like you got a guy out here who is telling his people to primary Thomas Massie and telling them to support Lindsey Graham.
Doesn't that say it all? Let that one sink in. That is
Moments ago, official details emerged regarding the topics discussed by President Vladimir Putin during the extraordinary meeting of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, which occurred on April 1, 2025. As it turns out, insiders in the Kremlin were correct. Vladimir Putin had indeed talked with Security Council members about Ukraine's repeated violations of the agreement to cease attacks on energy infrastructure, alongside strategies to address the increasing threat from the North Atlantic Alliance. It is noteworthy that immediately after this meeting, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, made rather harsh statements against the United States. In particular, the Russian minister explicitly announced that Moscow had provided Washington with a list of energy facilities in Russia, targeted by the Ukrainian army after an agreement was reached on the so-called energy truce. At the same time, Sergei Lavrov accused President Donald Trump of not demanding that Kyiv end the war. According to Lavrov, the Trump administration only wants to find a scheme that suits Washington, and would allow for a conventional ceasefire. Regrettably, our American partners only want to achieve a ceasefire to initiate discussions about various schemes and models that will arise during the negotiation process. The United States continues to overlook our key demands, specifically addressing the root causes of this conflict. Naturally, we take the models and solutions proposed by the United States quite seriously. Nevertheless, Russia has a carefully considered set of priorities and approaches regarding this matter. And we will persist in defending our interests throughout the negotiation process with the Americans, Sergei Lavrov stated. This statement by the Russian minister caused a heated discussion among the expert community. In particular, the well-known expert and military journalist, Yuri Podolyaka, bluntly stated that Sergei Lavrov had voiced Putin's ultimatum to the United States. According to him, Russia has made it clear that Moscow does not care about Trump's threats to impose tough sanctions, and that the peace negotiation process will begin only when Kyiv completely withdraws its troops from the territory of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. And also undertakes to guarantee that Ukraine will never become a member of NATO. In addition, the Kyiv authorities will have to ban Nazi ideology in the rest of Ukraine, and abandon the ban on the Russian language. Thus, Russia has once again demonstrated that it will no longer allow the West to deceive itself, and that Moscow will not agree to make even minor concessions. Simultaneously with this, Russia continues to strengthen its northern and Baltic fleets, to further deter the North Atlantic Alliance both in the Baltic region and the Arctic. In particular, Russia has begun to strengthen its northern fist with the latest nuclear submarines and new generation warships. The main feature of these warships is that they are all equipped with new generation engines, which were fully designed and built using only Russian components. This week, all military analysts and intelligence representatives of NATO countries, and in particular the United States, were fixed onto their television screens, watching how the newest frigate Admiral Golovko entered the state tests in Russia. Admiral Golovko is the third ship of the so-called series of digital frigates of Project 22350. From the two previous ships, Admiral Golovko differs in armament and the latest engine, which was completely developed and produced by Russian engineers. My friends, in this video, I will tell you in detail why the latest Russian frigate and its new generation engine have become the subject of interest for Western experts and the military. The lead ship of Project 22350, Admiral Gorshkov, was laid down in 2006 at the Northern Shipyard and became the first combat surface ship of the Farsi Zone, designed and built in modern Russia. The next frigate of this project, Admiral Kasatonov, was laid down 3 years later, in April 2009. To date, both of these frigates are serving in the Northern Fleet of Russia. However, the further construction of these frigates turned out to be under a big question due to Ukraine's refusal to supply gas turbine units of the Enterprise Zorya Mashproekt to Russia. Fortunately for the Russian military, the specialists of the design bureau Almaz were able to quickly develop a replacement for the Ukrainian gas turbine units. And already in 2018, Northern Shipyard received the first Russian-made gas turbine units for the frigates being built there. It is worth noting that the third frigate of Project 22350, Admiral Golovko, which entered the state tests this week, was the first to receive the latest gas turbine unit, which was created in Russia and exclusively from Russian components. According to the developers, the latest gas turbine unit is essentially a new generation engine. And this engine contains many innovative solutions that currently have no analogs in the world. State tests of the frigate Admiral Golovko, which it is currently undergoing, should show the world not only the full combat power of this frigate, but also the reliability of its latest engine. It is the outcome of these tests that will let us understand whether Russian engineers and enterprises have coped with the incredibly responsible task of developing a new engine. After all, the Russian military intends to install these latest engines not only on ships of this project. Although, the construction of frigates of this series was delayed due to Western sanctions and Ukraine's refusal to supply gas turbines, as we see, this delay went to the benefit of the newest frigate Admiral Golovko. The newest frigate, which was released for testing, received not only a new generation engine, but also Zircon hypersonic missiles. In fact, Admiral Golovko became the first regular carrier of hypersonic missiles in the Russian fleet. In addition, the newest frigate also received the latest anti-aircraft complex Polymetry DUT, which allows you to place 32 medium-range missiles and 128 short-range missiles. The close defense of the frigate is provided by two newest anti-aircraft artillery systems Palash, and a universal 130mm cannon AK-192, which hits targets at a distance of up to 23 kilometers, with a rate of fire of 30 rounds per minute. The anti-submarine armament of Admiral Golovko consists of four newest universal torpedo tubes Paket-NK. Since the Russian military managed to solve the problem with the new engine, the project took on a new life. The fourth ship of this project, Admiral Isakov, will be launched very soon. Another 4 frigates are under construction and will be launched in 2025. Moreover, the Russian Ministry of Defense is preparing to lay 2 more frigates of the same project. Meanwhile, Russia also began to work on the creation of a modernized version of the frigate of Project 22350. It is reported that the upgraded frigate will receive even more advanced electronics and a doubled strike arsenal. Sources in the Ministry of Defense don't exclude that unmanned drones may also appear on board the latest frigates. These drones will be both reconnaissance and strike. Thus, the testing of the frigate Admiral Golovko already marks the beginning of a new stage in the development of Russian shipbuilding, which in turn will give impetus to the creation of new ships, which will already belong to new, more advanced projects. Thus, as you can see, Russia has dealt a triple blow to the West. First, Moscow has issued a harsh ultimatum to the United States regarding the negotiation process. Secondly, Putin silenced Trump, making it clear that he is not afraid of even the toughest sanctions from Washington. And finally, thirdly, the Russian military-industrial complex continues to strengthen the capabilities of the Russian army both in the Baltic region and the Arctic. According to military experts, Russia completely dominates the Northern Hemisphere from a military point of view. Already, the Russian Northern Fleet and the nuclear icebreaking fleet, significantly exceed the capabilities of all Western countries combined. Furthermore, reports indicate that by 2050, this superiority will only double.
Go figure. Follow me.